call the Committee of the Whole for April 13th to order. Is there any additions to the agenda? Councillor McGrath.
I'd like to propose agenda item number 8.6 under new business be a discussion on utility expenses, please.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Other additions? Seeing as none, can I have somebody to approve today's agenda? Councillor Janot, thank you. All in favor? None opposed. I see that is carried. We have 3 sets of minutes in front of us. March 23rd, Committee of the Whole minutes. They were circulated. Any omissions, corrections? Seeing as none, can I have somebody to approve those minutes? Councillor McGrath, all in favor? Thank you. 4.2, March 24th, Committee of the Whole budget discussion minutes. They were circulated. Any errors, omissions, corrections? Seeing as none, can I have somebody to approve the March 24th minutes? Councillor Butler, thank you. All in favor? That is carried. 4.3, March 31st, 2021, Committee of the Whole budget discussion minutes were circulated. Any errors, omissions, deletions, corrections? Mayor Ireland.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Keller-Rampe. On this one, it's a small technical issue, but I noticed that at the opening of the minutes, 7 councillors are indicated as present. But at the first vote, nobody has left or been added, but we only have 5 councillors voting. So the record should reflect that there were only 5 available for that vote because nobody announced a conflict or is otherwise allowed to not vote. So I don't have the timing myself, but the record is a little bit off, reflecting that we did not have all 7 for that initial vote.
You're correct, Mayor Ireland, because I didn't join the meeting till 1 o'clock, and I believe Councillor Wilson came in for part of it in the afternoon. So you are correct.
That's right, and it does indicate later that you joined the meeting at 1 o'clock, but it opens with an indication that you were there when we opened. So, and Councillor Wilson similarly was not available. So I just draw that to everybody's attention. It can get corrected in time.
Thank you, Mayor Ireland. With that corrections, that will come later. And can we have somebody to approve those minutes? Thank you, Councillor McGrath. We'll approve the minutes with the corrections. All in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. We have no presentations today, Mr. Given. Do we have business arising from any of minutes or any previous minutes that somebody wants to bring up? Seeing as none, we'll move ahead. Policy and governance, council strategic priority. Any council discussion, any updates? Seeing as none, we'll move right ahead. New business, paid parking scope. Mr. Given.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Keller-Rampe. Council administration is back with revisions to the paid parking 2021 project as directed at the previous Council Committee of the Whole meeting. You can see here administration has revised the program to look at the areas that are currently under the 2-hour parking limits. This comprises altogether 244 stalls and 2 disabled stalls. You can see in the report, and by now you probably have seen this this format a couple of times, and so you're familiar with the layout of the report. Administration has made some high-level forecasts of revenue, and I think important to note that, as discussed before, in order to make the program viable in these areas, administration would recommend that it should be at a $2 per hour rate. And so the financial forecast is based on a $2 per hour rate. You can see a revenue forecast of $369,000 and an expense forecast of approximately $136,500 for a potential return after expenses for this project scope of $232,500. I guess important to note that administration hasn't stopped the dialogue with stakeholders. Ms. Nadon has had an initial meeting with what we would imagine as the basis of our stakeholder committee, recognizing that as we go further into a specific project scope, we would revise that. But we have met with 2 representatives from the Chamber of Commerce, as well as a representative from Tourism Jasper. All participants in that stakeholder committee confirmed that they did not have concerns at a high level about the concept of paid parking in Jasper. None of them, including Tourism Jasper, felt that it would be an impact on visitor numbers. And in fact, they asserted that generally visitors to Jasper are paying for parking in their home communities. And so it would not be a surprise to them to pay for parking in Jasper. And actually we hear from our staff, at least on an anecdotal basis, that visitors often come and may ask a bylaw officer where they're supposed to pay for parking today because they come fully expecting it. So we don't see that as a concern. The concern that was raised by the stakeholders, and I think that we all need to acknowledge with this enhanced project scope, is the potential impact on residents. Council has been aware of that from day one, and obviously that's been central to some of the considerations that you've made. So there's essentially 2 parts, 2 facets to that potential impact on residents. First would be the question of whether or not residents pay for parking in the paid parking zone. And second would be how we will manage the potential of visitor parking in residential areas. Now, we all know that Parks Canada has a fantastic resident parking system that is already implemented, and administration's recommendation would be that we use that rather than implementing our own resident parking system in any case. For this year, administration does not have a recommendation, just given the time that this is coming up, the couple of cycles that we've gone through, and the fact that this enhanced scope is different than administration's initial recommendation. We do not have a recommendation for you on exactly how we would address visitor parking in residential areas with this larger scope for a couple of reasons. First, if we took an approach of saying there is no visitor parking on any residential street outside of the paid parking areas, that could be really challenging to implement, because we have, of course, PHAs scattered throughout the community where we would have non-residents parking on public streets. In time, that would be an enhancement that we could make to the program, is finding a way to account for that. And this is not to suggest that that would be impossible or particularly burdensome. I think it's something that could be done well, but it would take some thought and time. And frankly, where we are in terms of the timelines of this project, administration hadn't initially been proposing the scope, and so was not something that we have developed a concept for. I'd suggest that that's something we'd need to revise in future years. The other challenge would be that in order for us to make resident-only parking throughout the balance of the municipality in the residential areas would require a change to other bylaws, because currently there is no restriction that prohibits anybody from parking on those streets other than, as council knows, for the time limits. So there's nothing, so we would also have to change additional bylaws to enable resident-only parking. So administration's recommendation is, I guess, first an acknowledgement that we're aware of those challenges, that we would propose that through the course of this year, we assess the impacts of that, because I think at this stage, we all have a perception of what the impacts will be, but we have no data. And that we bring to council in the fall recommendations on how to address any impacts that are actually realized through the course of the program. So that would be the residential parking, the visitor parking in residential areas. There was some discussion at the last council meeting when we discussed this project scope about the concept of residents paying in the pay zone. I think council needs to make a decision about whether, you know, paid parking is paid parking and everybody uses it and everybody pays for the cost of that, or if there's some other system. Administration's recommendation would be that it should be a consistent approach for the ease of implementation. And council may want to discuss that. But those were the concerns that were identified by the stakeholder committee. Additionally, administration, I think, is compelled to say that this larger area, it will be more challenging to collect data to get a differentiation or establish a baseline. We don't have any comparative data from previous years about who parks where or how people's sentiments are about parking. And so with this large change, we'd be doing it all at once, and we would be able to assess how it goes through this year, but we wouldn't necessarily have anything to compare it against. In one of the initial proposals, you know, the concept was to say, what are people's sentiment and feelings in the area that's adjacent to paid parking? And what are people's sentiment in the areas that are not adjacent to paid parking? And so we could get a little bit of a compare and contrast in the same year to see how it goes. That wouldn't be possible under this larger approach. The benefit of this larger approach is that there is, of course, a high revenue potential, as shown in the report. We should note that a really preliminary sketch about the impact of the crossover of the sidewalk seating program and the concept of paid parking. If you took 2 parking stalls and ran the math, it's approximately $3,000 of loss to the municipality for those 2 parking stalls through the course of the time period that we're proposing to have paid parking. So again, related to that conversation we had about fees last week, this is another data point to suggest that if the municipality is looking to get revenue from paid parking, generally from visitors, that allowing our businesses to expand into parking lanes in the places where they choose to do so does impact the potential of the municipality to increase revenue from those parking stalls. A smaller item, but that was raised specifically because we are not charging for parking in the off-street parking areas. This should encourage users to use those as a primary location. If the $2 an hour is the kind of thing that would encourage somebody to drive out of their way. It may or may not be, and that's something we can assess. But because we're not targeting that parking lot close to the off-leash area, there would be no impact on the off-leash area users. And I think, council, this really covers the broad base of the report. Again, you're very familiar with the issue because we've gone through it a couple of times, but we believe that this reflects the scope as directed by council at the last committee of the whole meeting. And I can also report that Ms. Melnichuk has continued with the RFP process for a provider. We saw a very good response from a number of different providers that are interested in providing the service, and administration is currently undertaking an assessment of those RFP submissions, and we'll still be in a place to be able to choose a provider to implement the program should council choose to go ahead this year. And with that, Deputy Mayor Keller MP, that's my report.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Questions from Mr. Given? On the report? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you for that, Mr. Given. I would just, I guess I would like to speak to the impact on residential parking. I know there are definitely going to be some growing pains in this first year, but I would definitely like to see the outcomes of those conflicts, I guess I would say. In reality, residential properties are required to offer at least 2, if not more, off-site parking. So if a resident is depending on street parking for their primary parking, that's not the municipality's, I guess, problem. It's really that resident's issue using their property for other purposes. And if they're going to continue to do so, that's fine. Although they would have to then just deal with the fact that there may be more more traffic in front of their in front of the residents. And so unfortunately that will just be an outcome of paid parking. I'd like to see how it unfolds throughout the first year. and then we can deal with it with resident passes, etc. From there. But again, we got to remember that residents are required to have at least 2, if not, in a new development 6. So that's where they should be parking. They should be coming off the road. I guess the other question I had was, and I'm assuming it's the case, but I'd really like to see a robust, like, informational, promotional attempt directing visitors to those parking lots, right? Like, off the top of my head, I don't know if some of these parking lots, well, not all of the parking lots would be paid, I'm assuming, but there should be at least quite a bit of promotional information. I'm not sure how you get it out to visitors, maybe at the gate if we can get parks on board with that. But I think that's really where we're going to win, if we can tell people where to park, and if we can tell people where to go, and we can easily direct them where to go, highlight where they are on a small municipal map. That's how we're going to get buy-in. And yeah, I think this is great. I'm in support of moving forward with in support of moving forward with some type of paid parking, and this seems like we're going in the right direction here.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Janot. Mr. Gibbon, you wanted to respond to Councillor Wilson?
Yeah, if I could, with apologies to council, just wanted to, Councillor Wilson asked how administration would propose to get the word out, essentially. And I should point out that we did increase supplies and signage in the expense forecast with the intent of doing increased communications and public signage. Administration would take a positive approach. First off, we have to inform people about where they do have to pay for parking. But more importantly, or as importantly, I think as Councillor Wilson was getting to, we need to inform people about where their options are for free parking. And we would do that in a positive way, that it is highlighting those options that they have. And so administration has considered that, and that's why we increased some of the expenses so that we'd have more resources to be able to increase signage or do additional public information campaigns.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbon. Councillor Janot, then Councillor Demota.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. We have 3 in the downtown core, 3 older hotels that rely on on-street parking for their guests. Have we had any discussion with them or any consideration for overnight parking for these people? Or if they happen to stay for more than 1 day, do we have any provisions for that?
Go ahead, Mr. Gibbon.
Councillor Keller, MP, to Councillor Janot. Councillor Janot, you're 100% correct. This is one of the potential risks of this type of program. The older hotels that don't have as much on-site parking would have to direct their clients to use the free public parking areas. And again, those would be free during the day and overnight. And so if they needed overnight parking, it would need to be in those off-street areas, or of course, outside of the time where people, if they park overnight on street, would be free, but starting in the morning, they would have to pay. So I think it is a change. I think it is likely that we would have some input from those hotels about the impact on their guests. And I think that is something that council just needs to acknowledge, that is going to be a challenge with a project scope of this size that deals with on-street paid parking in front of those properties.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbon. Councillor Demota.
Thank you. I think what's really important, and two of you have already alluded to the communication piece to the people, the tourists and the visitors to Jasper. The other piece that I think is going to be integral is communicating the process and the design to the community on a greater scale, not just through council meetings, because I think stakeholder buy-in is going to be key to this. In our success, and having the community understand the process and the purpose of it will be, I think, very important. So things to remember. And thank you.
Other questions for Mr. Gibbon? Mr. Gibbon, I have one. Under the expenses forecast, the 61,000 for staff, does that mean we'll have 2 extra bylaws for that 2 extra bylaw employees for that time to cover the program with our current bylaw?
Thanks, Deputy Mayor Keller-Hempy. Yes, so it would be summer staff. Administration has already brought on the one in anticipation of a summer paid parking program. The additional would be for an additional summer position.
Thank you. Councillor Butler.
Thanks very much, Mr. Given. I appreciate the details provided here. I wanted to express support for the recommendation and the 3 bullet points associated with it, exactly as presented. And would be willing to make that motion. I think you've hit it right. There are some unknowns. Councillor Wilson pointed to them directly, and I agree completely that it's important that council acknowledge for the community that we do realize there will be impacts on residential areas, but we have to start somewhere. And it was our choice to start with the downtown parking. There are going to be outcomes and difficulties to navigate. We will learn as we go. And I have no doubt that this being a pilot project year, that we will know more at this time next year and will be in a better position to manage and mitigate some of those concerns. I wanted to mention one more thing relative to what Councillor Wilson mentioned about the requirement for residents to provide on-street parking, because Mr. Given had mentioned that there might be a concern with private home accommodation guests, but even more than residential parking, it's worth pointing out that Parks Canada requires all of those providing private home accommodation to provide off-street parking for all their guests. So really there isn't a reason for private home accommodation guests to be parking on the residential streets. So I think in that respect, we're already pretty well positioned. I'm not suggesting any change, but it's just worth pointing out that we already have a system in place that I think should deal with what otherwise could be an issue. I only have one question, and that was just about the timing. I don't want to get into the details of the project because I trust administration to roll it out as it should be rolled out. But generally, I think it's true that sort of the traditional end to the tourism season in Jasper is the Monday of the Thanksgiving long weekend. September 30th is nothing more than the end of a month. And I wondered if it wouldn't make more sense just notionally in terms of what we hope to accomplish here, that we would end the program on Thanksgiving Monday, which is the last really busy tourism weekend that the town normally experiences before we sort of roll into the shoulder season. That would be a suggestion that I would offer. Otherwise, I'd be happy to make that motion to recommend this forward to the next council meeting.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. Just one of the things that Mr. Given mentioned in his introduction is that we have to discuss whether we believe that residents should pay for downtown parking as well. That's one of the things that Mr. Given, I believe you need direction on.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor Keller-Hempy. I would say that it is something that council should discuss. Administration, with our recommendation that's here in the report, we would move forward with paid parking in the downtown zone, and all users of the parking would pay for those spaces. If council wished to do something different, then it would be up to council to make that decision. And I just will say that I think that it's a reasonable discussion for council to have about whether everyone should pay equally, and whether we're trying to encourage Jasper residents to walk when possible, although it's not always possible, granted, and whether we're, if there is a risk, and I'll be frank, if there is a sense that residents can park for free, it is possible that we may miss the intent of the program of encouraging turnover in these spaces in the downtown core to allow more visitors to come and access. When parking is free, it becomes the easiest choice potentially for an employee to drive and park their car and just leave it there during their work shift. And so council should have a thoughtful discussion about that and recognize that you are likely to hear about it, whatever decision that you make. But it is, I think if the goal is to encourage turnover in the downtown area, to the benefit of the businesses by allowing more opportunity for visitors to park there, then our recommendation would be that everybody should pay the same, whether they're resident or visitor in the downtown core.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Councillor Butler had his hand up just before Mr. Given spoke. I'm not sure if he wants to clarify something within his motion.
No, I'm fine. I'll wait. Thank you.
Yeah, Councillor McGrath.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Keller MP. I appreciate you bringing that point forward, and I appreciate administration requesting us to discuss this today. This is one of the main areas that I'm having a hard time with the suggestion that residents would pay in the downtown areas that are suggested to pay for tourism. And I believe that our focus is to generate some additional revenues to lessen the burden on our ratepayers and lessen the burden on our taxpayers. Therefore, I see the people appropriate to be charged for downtown parking to be the visitors that come into Jasper, not the residents. I'm thinking specifically of our senior population and our mobility challenged population. And I'm thinking of business owners that do not have back alley access, that would require to park in front of their storefront to unload many things from their trunk without, say, in my situation, walking across Connaught on a busy summer day, unloading everything that's necessary to get into your storefront. I believe that we should not charge residents in the paid parking areas, that their resident permit pass that they already have would be the permit that says that they are not charged, but maybe within a certain context of, say, a 2-hour maximum, so that we still do have them able to do their business, conduct themselves, go in for a haircut, but come out and carry on with their day, park at their residential space that's allocated to them within the community, and allow turnover for the rest of the day in that spot with visitors to the community. I would not be in favor of charging residents for downtown parking.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Councillor Demota.
I understand where Councillor McGrath is coming from, and I think, you know, the idea of limiting some type of access there, but permitting or finding a way to allow people to do what she just recommended. You know, we don't want to see employees or other people coming in and using a parking stall for 8 hours while they complete their shift. You know, when that could be accessed to create turnover. So I'm sure that there'll be a good system that we can come up with to implement both. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Demota. Councillor Janot.
Again, reflecting on Councillor McGrath's comments, I appreciate where she's coming from, but I also acknowledge the comments that were made by Mr. Given, which was consistency and ease of implementation. And I think for year one, I'd like to follow with the recommendations that were made. So straightforward, applies to everybody. We can make changes later, but I think that to start relaxing right from the start will lead to some difficulties, for lack of a better word, sorry. But for the summer period only, it's 4 months, be consistent, applies to everybody. And we'll deal with it. Remember, we talked about this being a pilot project or a learning experience. So I think we'll stick with the recommendation that's made by the administration. Thank you.
Mr. Given, if I'm correct, we're going to operate this from 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 at the current signs?
Councillor Keller MP, I believe it is 8 to 5, but I would stand to be corrected on that. But I believe it's 8 to 5.
Okay,
we would be consistent with the current 2-hour parking regulations.
Okay. Councillor Butler.
I agree with the councillors who are suggesting that we don't already at the beginning of our pilot project start making exceptions. You know, I know it will be difficult and it will in fact anger some residents, but it is the nature of every decision we make here in this room, which is no longer a room, that you know, every decision we make has direct benefits for some, indirect benefits for some, and negatives for others. And it is the nature of municipal decisions. And I'm concerned sometimes that every time we, not every time, but sometimes when we approach making decisions, we become very concerned, and we should be, that yes, this will cause some difficulties, but it can cause us to lose the courage to make the decisions that need to be made for the broader benefit of the community. And so where parking is concerned downtown, residents have responsibilities too. And it seems to me to make sense to go in the direction that has been recommended. And Councillor McGrath mentioned people with disabilities and mobility challenged people and so on, but we have quite a high number of designated parking spaces downtown, and there is also commercial parking space made available for some of the shops. So I think, again, we can watch and see how this works for this year before we begin already creating exceptions.
Councillor McGrath.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Keller MP. My question is for Mr. Given. Speaking logistically from a, say, bylaw perspective, right now, there are already bylaw officers walking around our community chalking tires. So my suggestion of implementing a residential pass as it already exists, I'm curious to see what the difference would be with the idea I presented with the residential pass granting free downtown parking for residents. And that would simply be monitored the same way that it's monitored today. So I don't see any change in the actual work that would need to happen. Therefore, I don't see very much confusion. And I do see it as a simplistic way to move forward to honor the residents of Jasper and also receive some additional revenue for the town to have to offset our tax.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I believe that for administration in terms of implementation, it would be a simple check as the officers are going through. They would, I mean, at a really practical level, has this car paid for parking? Yes, no. No, it hasn't. Okay. Is this car resident or non-resident? Yes, no. And then, action as appropriate. So I don't think it would be a substantive change. And I think it is an important philosophical discussion. We have mentioned the different types of users that may need to use their vehicles, and totally appreciate that. I think it's also important to note that there are some people on limited incomes who may not drive, and so there is sort of a cross subsidization there of the municipality maintaining parking for those people who drive cars, where those people who don't drive cars don't receive any benefit from that. And so, it can run into the risk of being, this big philosophy. And so that's where it is useful for council to have this discussion about where you land on that philosophical underpinning. But on the practical matter of implementation, I don't believe it would be a substantial change for bylaw to view whether or not somebody was a resident in the paid parking area.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Mayor Ireland.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Kelleher MP. I think that there is a motion on the floor from Councillor Butler, and I speak in support of that motion, and particularly as it relates to whether the parking fee should be universally applied. I agree that it ought to be, and not that past practice sets the course for this council, but we would never have considered that the 2-hour parking, when it was implemented, would not apply to residents. It has always been thus. It applies to whoever uses that public space. And I see no difference in principle applying the same principle to to paid parking in the downtown core. I do, though, have some other comments. This is a pilot project, and I agree that we will learn things from the months that we implement this pilot for this year. But because it is a pilot, I would not be the least bit adverse to making changes as we go within this year. And I'm thinking particularly as things begin to unfold and we find where there might be difficulties, we should, I think, be prepared to be somewhat adaptable. And I'm thinking in particular about whether or not we could have a system of permits, which might be other than the park issue passed, that would be available to residents who, for example, might have family visiting who would want to park on the street because they conceivably would not have off-street parking available for family members. And that it's tough to interrupt family visits when they're allowed again in COVID times. And similarly for those downtown hotels, perhaps they could have a system of guest passes where if checkout is 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning, their guests could have parked overnight on the street and be safe until checkout time or thereabouts. I don't want to unduly inconvenience people, but there are some small steps that I think we could implement as we go, even within the first year of the pilot project. But all that said, I support the recommendation brought forward by staff and the motion put forward by Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Mayor Ireland. Councillor Demota.
Well, those are very good points, and thank you for introducing those, Mr. Mayor. And that brought me back to when I was working in the hotel sector, and you know, people that were parking on the street, they were told or you know, became under the impression that because we had 2-hour parking that started at 9 o'clock, they had up until 11 o'clock, which is the time of some checkouts to move their vehicle. So this is kind of where, you know, when you start a 2-hour implementation, it will be starting at 9 o'clock. So whereas in the past you had up until 11 o'clock to move your vehicles, now, you know, I think that's a pretty good assessment and a recommendation moving forward to tweak with, you know, those little things that might arise. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Demota. Councillor Butler, would you like to close debate before I call the question?
Thank you very much. I only have one thing to add, and I think that it's worth pointing out that from a strategic and philosophical point of view, we have in various places at various times stated that we want to promote non-motorized transportation. We see Jasper as a pedestrian-friendly community. We want to emphasize non-motorized transportation and pedestrian traffic and de-emphasize and decrease the importance and the space taken up and the cost taken up by vehicles, frankly. And this is part of what that looks like. So I think it is absolutely a step in the right direction. We absolutely won't get it all right. The community needs to understand that it is a pilot project, but I'm very satisfied that we are moving in a direction where we can correct and adjust as we go along, and that we will have a healthier and stronger community as a result, rather than the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. And Mr. Gibbon, you're happy to look at some of those corrections as we move forward through the summer with the pilot project?
Yes, Deputy Mayor Keller MP, we will look at those and revise as possible and as they come forward. And I think important to say that everybody will be looking for some consistency. One thing that I believe, at least you know, it's a belief, but that I believe that businesses and residents need is some consistency. And so we wouldn't be looking to bring in a change to the program every week that would necessitate new signage and new public communications. In an ideal situation, we would have some kind of extended period. So we will absolutely assess whether there are acute issues that need to be addressed through the course of the program this year. If there are things that are less than acute, we would track those and report those back to council at the conclusion of the pilot program for revisions to future years.
Thank you, Mr. Given, to you and your staff for all the work on this. I'm sure Mr. Jones had a lot of work into this too. I'd just like to thank the Bylaw department and your department and Mrs. Malinshaw. Just before the call to question, I do want to confirm something with Councillor Butler. Are you proposing in your motion that we move this to the Monday of Thanksgiving in October? Or are you quite content to leave it at September 30th, Councillor Butler?
Thank you very much for mentioning that. I would actually like to have the motion worded to move to, I believe it's the 11th of October. And I thank you. I had forgotten that I didn't mean to do that. That would be till October 11th. But I don't really want to do that without, I don't think we heard a response from Mr. Given about whether, I mean, if that was considered and decided against by administration, then maybe there's a reason that you picked the 30th.
No, Deputy Mayor Keller, MP, if I may, administration can work with that. That's absolutely no problem. So, and perhaps just for the purpose of the motion, maybe it's until the 12th, which is actually the Tuesday following Thanksgiving. And then it's just, we go through the Thanksgiving weekend with it. The program concludes on the 12th.
So I will amend my motion with the will of council to read the 12th of October for the end date. I didn't question the beginning date because I'm assuming administration has decided that's when they're ready to roll it out. So.
Okay. I'm going to call the question then. Councillor Butler made a motion that the program runs from May 3rd, 2021 to October 12, 2021. In the area currently subject to 2-hour parking and for the same posted hours, and with a parking permit system for residents in areas adjacent to residential housing, even though we know that the Bylaw department may just take information on what's happening in those areas with this pilot project. I'm calling the question. All in favor? Six in favor, opposed? One opposed. That motion is carried. Thank you again, everybody. (8.2) property tax receivable. Mr. Given.
Yes, Councillor Keller, MP, as we get towards closing out the 2020 year and are a significant way through our audit, there are a couple of items that need to come in front of council for council's attention in alignment with our policies of administrative authority. The first is a write-off that administration is recommending of property tax receivable. This is related to the provincial building and the province's program of grants in place of taxes. In 2019, going back a little bit, the full levy amount that administration put forward on the provincial building was just over $47,000. That was issued, and the municipality received a payment in the amount of $35,000, which I believe was approximately 75% of the value. This year, the province has informed us that they will be paying 50% of the value, which is a total of only $22,743.92. And so it is administration's recommendation that unfortunately we should write off this amount because it will not be received from the province, and we really don't have any authority to send them to collections. Having said that, this was a specific policy choice that the province has made in their budget 2019-2020 fiscal plan. They identified that they would begin a process of essentially reducing the amount of property tax that the province pays. Many municipalities have objected to this in recognition that property taxes pay for the hard services that surround physical properties, like the cost of firefighting services, like the cost of bylaw enforcement, like the cost of street sweeping. None of those costs have gone away, but the province has made a decision that they don't wish to pay the property tax that's related to their provincial properties. This has been the subject of significant advocacy from municipalities across the province, and yet it is not within our authority to change the province's mind on that, or, as I said, to send them to collections. So that's why administration is coming forward with this recommendation that we write off the amount. at an administrative level. Council may wish to take other advocacy measures, but administratively, in order to close off the 2020 year, this is a process that we need to undertake.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbon, for that. Councillor Demoda.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Kelleher MP. Through you to Mr. Gibbon. I think from the process, from what I understand, what we charge the province as far as what we consider rent for the space goes, it's based on what that property is assessed at, and then it's on square footage, correct? And there's no way of maybe assessing that at that property at a higher value, what it's worth to the community.
Councillor Kelleher MP, Councillor Demoda. Council will remember that we just had the presentation from the municipal assessor, Mr. Brittles, last week, I believe it was. And so the property tax assessment system is highly regulated. They use the same methodology on all properties. And so the market value is derived in the same way. Unfortunately, I believe it would be very challenging to identify a different market value than is arrived at by our assessor. And I don't think there's a methodological change that would get us back to the appropriate level of provincial contribution towards municipal services.
I realize that I'm not the first person to think of that, but at the same time, you want to get a fair return on the stakeholder investment. So any type of creative approach, I'll always try to consider if it comes to mind. So thank you for your time.
Councillor Janelle.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is kind of unfortunate. The province is leaning on the little guy. But I think we, in our contacts with the elected officials and so on and so forth, the province, we have to remind them that they're getting a good deal from Jasper. They're going to take this reduced amount from us. They're going to charge us for rural policing, for which we don't get any benefits. And it appears that our property valuations are going to go up. So from a province-wide perspective, most small towns, their valuations are going down because of the loss of activity, mostly due to the oil activity. So that we're going to be paying more and they're going to be paying less. So just to remind them, they're getting good value from Jasper. Thank you.
Mayor Ireland.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Kelleher MP. For Mr. Gibbon, through you, perhaps to staff as necessary, I would like to have a better understanding of the repercussions on staff and administration if council was to choose the option that is listed, that is, leave this amount showing on the books as a receivable, even though we know that it will never be received.
Yes, Your Worship, Ms. Melnichuk may wish to speak to that about sort of what that looks like practically. But I would say that it, by generally accepted accounting principles, isn't an appropriate approach. If we are aware that it is a debt that is not likely to be repaid, then we need to acknowledge that within our financial statements. It would be a misrepresentation of that, that fact that is known to us if we were to leave it on the books, which could lead a reader of the financial statements to assume that that's revenue that we imagine that we could sometime in the future realize. And at an administrative level, I think we understand that that is not likely.
Mr. Gibbon.
Thank you for that.
Mr. Gibbon, so in 2019, 75%, in 2020, 50%. So in 21 is going to be 25%. Like, are they eventually going to try and beat this out? Is that
there is, Deputy Mayor Kelleher MP, there is not a clear indication from the province what their future intent is. I will say that they have amended their approach on this issue. When they first announced it, there were many municipalities, well, and not many, there are a number of municipalities that have a very high percentage of their tax base as provincial properties, either seniors facilities or those that just have really significant provincial infrastructure, provincial buildings in their communities. And it had a very substantial effect on a limited number of municipalities. The province has amended their approach to lessen the impact on those municipalities where it was acute. So I think it shows that this is a provincial policy decision that is subject to and may respond to political pressure and advocacy. And so that would be up to council to choose how you wish to approach that. Administration's purpose here today is, really just to identify what we need to do to close out our year end. But I would encourage council to think how you wish to advocate to our local MLA and the provincial government on the impact of this change on Jasper taxpayers.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Councillor McGrath.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Keller MP. I agree, and I thank Mr. Given for that clarity, because I was thinking about probably being one of the more fortunate communities in this regard of us only having one provincial building. And while it is inequitable and it is unfair and it feels like a very large, it feels very against us as a municipality that the province would do this or would consider this. I also am trying to look at the perspective of, we do get great value for the space that we rent from the province on Patricia Street. The rate in which we pay for the building that we rent for our much necessary and much needed services that Community Outreach Services provides the residents of Jasper is a very nominal fee in comparison to what market value would be elsewhere. We would be looking at, probably 4 to 6 times the rate that we currently pay if we were paying market value. So while this is hard to digest and feels very unfair, I believe that we should be following administration's recommendation to write off the $22,000 for this year. And provincial advocacy should absolutely continue, but I wouldn't want to play hardball with the province, knowing how fortunate we are to receive the building that we have that serves the residents of Jasper.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Any other comments before I ask for a motion for this to come in front of council on April 23rd? Is there anybody prepared to make a motion to bring this receivable? Councillor McGrath?
I'll make that motion.
Okay. Any other comments, any other debate? Okay, I'll call the question that this receivable comes back in front of council on April 23rd. All in favor? Any opposed? It's carried. Thank you, Mr. Given. 2020 utility receivable.
Yes, thanks, Deputy Mayor Keller, MP. A very similar item for council, more within municipal control, at least not subject to the whims of the provincial government and their budget policy choices. Administration is recommending that council write off utility receivables in the amount of $44,092.99. To speak to this issue, as council knows, there were significant changes at the wastewater treatment plant in 2019-2020 with the change of operators. That change of operators also came with a substantially increased cost of operation and challenges with the billing from the operator to the municipality, which impacted our ability to inform all of our customers about their rates. Generally, that is not a challenge because the majority of customers are on the regular rate schedule. There is a certain high volume customer of the wastewater treatment plant that is billed in a slightly different way, that they receive a percentage of the total operating costs of the facility. Through the course of 2020, that increased cost was not accounted for in time for them to be able to incorporate it. Administration has had a discussion with them about our forward forecast of costs as we move to a new operator. And we have discussed with them the regularity of the billing that they will receive from the municipality. And they have agreed to be able to make up a substantial portion of the increased costs in 2020. But it's my recommendation that council should support the write-off of this $44,000 in recognition of the significant challenges that the business faced in 2020 and that we faced in terms of that operational cost and the billing challenges that we saw from the operator. So again, this is to aid our close off of the 2020 year. By policy, administration, and we may wish to, I see that policy review is a discussion later on in the agenda, but this may be an area where we may want to consider additional administrative authority. We only have the ability to go up to $1,000 of write-offs in any sort of level. I wouldn't suggest that a $44,000 write-off should be within administrative authority, but we are here because it is a policy requirement to come to council, and I'm happy to answer any questions about the recommendation. Questions
for Mr. Given? Mr. Given, can we use most money for this write-off?
I think, Councillor Keller-Hempy, it's likely that we would have to do that. In any case, subject to council finalizing the operating budget, there is the recommendation that we create a reserve that would allow for unexpected expenses. I think that this is something that, depending on what council chooses as the use of that reserve, could be managed. I think it's important to note that that it is likely that between these two and the other challenges from 2020, it's likely we will have to come to you with a year-end closeout that that demonstrates that we were in a deficit position, and so we would need to use some of that reserve funds, which is essentially what they were intended for, to close out the year in a balance.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Councillor Butler.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of three questions, initially at least for clarification. Mr. Given, the second last paragraph under background, please clarify me. It says this increase was substantially higher. I don't understand what that means. The increase was higher than expected, so we knew there would be an increase, but the increase was higher than expected. What does that mean?
I think it's on two parts, Councillor Butler. The increase in the operational cost with EPCOR was higher than the municipality expected, and it was higher than the utility customer was expecting. They were not made aware early in the year of the fact that they should account in their own accounting system for increased utility costs. When the municipality did receive from our operator the flow numbers, the monthly flow numbers, because this customer is based on a percentage of the total flow, it was substantial. The increase was substantial and was far above what they had been previously billed approximately $7,000 per month for their usage. And this was in the order of about $15,000 per month. So in their internal operations, they had set aside the $15,000, or sorry, the $7,000. When we finally received the flow numbers from the operator in October of 2020, we were in a position of having to go to this one customer. Again, they are dealt with different than all of our other customers, saying, through the course of 2020 up until October, your billing is essentially double what you were expecting it to be. And that's how we've arrived at this situation. So they have been able to account for a significant amount of that increased number. But it's my determination that based on some of our responsibility in this process, we need to share in some of that increased cost, and that we cannot simply pass it all on to the utility customer. It's really a matter of reasonableness. I believe there are a couple of breakdowns in process that we need to investigate. The first being why we were not getting flow numbers earlier from our operator, and why we were not informing our customer of that increased amount. Having said that, we have had great conversation with this customer. They are supportive and understanding of the municipality's need to see revenue above what they were budgeting for. And they also have appreciated the discussion about what our forward-looking costs are and how we may wish to review their arrangement in our utility bylaw, because it does put them at some risk where they are set as a percentage of the total flow. So, Councillor Butler, your question about why this was substantially higher, it was substantially higher both on the part of what the municipality was expecting and what the end customer was expecting, and that's what that line references.
Councillor Butler, go ahead.
May I follow up? Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Mr. Gibbon. That clarifies really my next question, which was the wording highly unanticipated costs, because certainly council was told prior to the end of 2019 that our costs were going to increase dramatically as we looked at new contractual arrangements. But you've acknowledged that there have been some adjustments necessary and some adjustments that weren't made along the way. So then my next question is really comes down to the nature of the request, because it's nuanced in two different ways. One way is that this reduction is necessary because it is simply uncollectible. I read between the lines a little bit and understand that there has been a process of discussion and negotiation, and that this is the outcome, and I'm fully prepared to accept that. That is one question. The other is that we're doing this because it was a difficult year and it's an issue around COVID. And that is quite a different question, because I think we're going to be looking at potentially a number of other operators who may feel that they have been billed utility buildings which have not been fair and reasonable in the context of the current year, and which council has suggested that we are open to having a conversation around with respect to the COVID relief reserve. So I think it's quite clear that we understand what we're doing at this point. I think if it's a question of providing relief due to a difficult year, this shouldn't be done in this way. It should be come back for a question of providing and making use of the COVID relief reserve for that purpose. If it really is an uncollectible receivable for other reasons, then we should do what is being requested here. And so I'd like some clarity around what really is the core rationale for this request.
Yeah. Yes.
COVID, is it an uncollectible receivable?
Yes. Thanks, Councillor Butler. Your first point there illustrates that you do understand the situation accurately, and so I think the answer is, unfortunately, Councillor Butler, it is both. In any other year, might administration have taken a bit of a different tactic and approach to? Well, I'll speak frankly. Would administration have taken a hard line in any other year? Yes, possibly. Does administration share some of the responsibility in this? Yes, we do. But would we have approached this differently if we couldn't reasonably say that we would acknowledge that this is not a year where any business is likely to be able to have additional funds to be able to come up with that they were not expecting. So it is, Councillor Butler, I wouldn't say that this is a COVID impacted administration's approach to how we negotiated on this item. So I think in any case, if council wished to direct this to be funded from reserves, that's something that would be possible. I mean, ultimately, I think if, you know, that is what administration will end up having to do. But if council wanted to, at this time, make the determination that this isn't just a write-off, that this amount be funded from reserves, then, you know, to make it a little bit clearer that that's why we're doing it, that would be acceptable as well. But as a practical matter, if we write this off as an unreceivable account and we close out the 2020 year in a deficit position, we have to have a balanced budget. And so we'll balance that budget by paying for it from reserves. You know, so in the end, practically it's going to happen the same way. But if council wish to make an explicit decision that yes, we'll do this, and we are recognizing that as more of a COVID related impact, and therefore we wish to fund this off from reserves, again, as a practical matter, the outcome will be the same. It would just be that council is making a bit of an explicit choice here. Administration doesn't think that's necessary at this time because we recognize that council is still going to engage in some decision-making about the reserve amounts subject to the outcome of the operational budget discussion. So that's why we're recommending it here is just a clean write-off amount. And as we have with the other item that came just before this one.
Mr. Given, Councillor Demotta.
Well, in simple terms, as we were going through this, and as I read it through again, you know, this is merely a staging process, and you know, understanding our responsibility to maybe in a situation that we didn't have full understanding of, and to get everybody up to where we need to be. So we're claiming some responsibility in the inefficiency, and you know, with a collaborative understanding that this is where we need to be, you know, going forward. So we're just kind of holding hands through the process, and that's kind of how I interpret it myself.
Councillor Demotta. Mayor Ireland, did I see your hand earlier?
You may have, although I think that most of my questions were posed by Councillor Butler, and I suppose I had one that I'm not entirely clear of. Mr. Given, the monthly operating costs have gone up significantly from the $40,000 range to the $100,000 range. At the same time, has the calculation of the share of this high volume user changed? The percentage amount is still the same, but it's now a percentage of an amount that's 2.5 times higher than it was. Is that correct?
Correct, Your Worship. Yes. Yeah. And you know, the shared responsibility here is that I think we can and should have done a better job of informing our customer of that in advance. And for a number of related issues, that wasn't possible and didn't happen. And so that's why we're making this recommendation to you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Given? Do I have somebody that's prepared to make a motion to direct administration to bring this back on April 28th to write off the utility receivable of account 01123.01 in the amount of $44,092.99? Mr. Butler?
Thanks. I just actually want to clarify, and I was going to raise it in the last issue as well, or the last item. Administration, unless I'm misunderstanding process, administration has not actually asked for a motion here. This is here for notice, and this motion would come forward at council. So I'm not even clear that a motion is requested here. There is no recommendation unless we wish to recommend otherwise. And I see Mr. Given willing to clarify that.
Yes, absolutely, Councillor Butler, Deputy Mayor Keller, MP. This, along with our sort of, I'm not sure if we can call it new anymore, but our process that we're trying to implement where committee recommends things forward, this should be phrased, and the previous one should have been phrased as committee recommend council. So you've seen the issue here in your position as committee. We've had discussion and questions to clarify understanding. You're recommending it forward to council, and then you know, the ultimate approval would happen at the next council meeting. So it's not substantially different than you've done in the past, but in terms of the phrasing, it should be committee recommend council.
Councillor Demona.
I'm happy to make that motion.
The committee recommends council to direct administration to write off the utility receivable in the amount of 44,092.99. Councillor Demona.
Yes.
Okay. All in favor? Any opposed? We will see that back in front of us on Tuesday, April 20th. 8.4, Council's Code of Conduct Bylaw. Mr. Gibbon.
Thanks very much, Deputy Mayor Keller, MP. I will provide a bit of brief context and then turn it over to Ms. Nadam to guide council through some of the essential questions that we're asking. As council will remember, on March 9th, we identified that we are not in compliant with provincial rules around establishing a council code of conduct via bylaw. At that time, council directed administration to bring forward changes as appropriate. And there are a number of options essentially that council needs to decide about which direction you wish to go. You'll see in the package a potential draft bylaw with the alternatives and options highlighted for you. And if Christine is there, I will ask her maybe to guide council through what some of those alternatives and options are, because they are policy choices. One that stands out to me is the discussion about, is this bylaw intended to apply just to council members, or is it intended to apply to public members on council committees? And so that would be things like the Culture and Rec Board and others. And so important policy choices that council has to make. And Christine, I see you on screen. Thanks very much. I'll ask you to guide council through some of the alternatives that are here. Council, what we'd be asking you to do today is to provide some guidance to you on these policy options so that administration could go away and develop a more finalized version of a draft bylaw that we would bring back to a future council committee of the whole and ultimately onto council for your approval. Christine, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Given. Good morning, Mayor and Council. As Mr. Given outlined, we've been working with the template that's been provided by AUMA is the organization that put it together. And essentially, as we started working with that, we realized there were quite a few options and those decisions should rest with council. So in this committee format, we would like to ask you for your input on what you would like to see in a final draft bylaw. And so those items are outlined in the report on the second page with those bullets, but are also reflected in green in the draft bylaw. I'm happy to walk you through them bullet by bullet if that's a process that's acceptable to council, and we can attempt to get some direction. And Deputy Mayor Kelleher MP, to your discretion, however you'd like to proceed.
I'm good with that. Ms. Nadon, if the rest of council is. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the first question, as Mr. Given outlined, is whether this bylaw should apply to elected officials only, or whether it should also apply to non-elected members of council committees. So again, that would be items like the Culture and Rec Board and an Environmental Responsibility Committee, for example. And I think both options are possible. I think the intent of this code of conduct is usually for elected officials, but that is an option. So we thought we would raise that with council. I don't have much insight to provide other than that, but looking for your direction on this one.
Council members, how do you?
Deputy Mayor Keller, if I could, I think at this stage, a bit of a round of discussion on each bullet point. I appreciate we're not necessarily at a point where we need specific motions, but if we could get a sense from council and we can kind of record that on each bullet, and then we would come back, as I said before, with a final revision where ultimately if council want to make specific changes, you could do those by motion. But here we're looking to get a bit of a sense. So this is more of a working session.
Councilor McGrath.
My feeling on the first point on who the code of conduct should apply to, I sort of am more aligned with it applying to everyone on boards and committees, and specifically because the municipality of Jasper has employees often at the tables of committees and boards that are council committees and boards. And those employees should never be subject to any wrongdoings or any code of conduct from anyone being disrespectful or whatnot. So I believe that if we can establish proper, professional, respectful code of conduct at every table that we sit at, that why wouldn't we?
Councillor Demota.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Kelleher MP. I agree with Councillor McGrath, and I think maybe also if this does goes through in that manner, that, you know, I know that we're revisiting committee structures and policies and procedures, and I think that maybe down the road we have welcome packages available to new committee members, you know, for however we develop the structure and when new people come aboard, so they have an understanding. And if this does become part of that be included in that package, so that people are understanding what they've signed up for, what the processes are, and you know, what the conduct is expected of them while they're on those committees. So I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you, Councillor Demota. Councillor Butler.
Thank you. My difficulty with using the broader designation is that when we talk about committees, and we've stumbled over this time and time again, we have all sorts of things that we sort of loosely refer to as committees. And some of them are separately constituted boards that have terms of reference. Others are something more like what is truly thought of as a committee of council. Others are completely separate bodies, like the Evergreen Foundation, for example. And there's so many differences that I think we would run ourselves into problems where we're really trying to police the behavior of others that we ought not to be in the business of doing so. So insofar as this document would regulate our own behavior as councillors while sitting on those boards, of course, I'm fully in favor. And I think that this code of conduct or others something similar to it should probably apply to people sitting on most public bodies, but I'm not sure that would be fruitful for us to do here. What I would suggest, rather than apply to all committees that councils may hold membership on, would be that when we discuss committees and we choose to provide terms of reference for a committee, let's suppose, for example, that we do, as we've talked about, reconstitute the Environmental Responsibility Committee, then within those terms of reference, we can always specify that the council code of conduct will apply to the members on that committee. But to do it in sort of an all or nothing fashion, I think could create more problems than it solves. So I would go with the narrower definition myself.
Councillor Demota.
Well, I think that's a healthy recommendation because, you know, from what I was taking from Councillor McGrath, it would be council committees of council. And I think those are easy to clarify. But I think that that process works just as well. And to keep this cleaner, then I'm willing to just keep it clean that way. But just with the understanding that, you know, what we discussed earlier with the actual committees of council, I think that's where it should apply, not to the broader representation of our appointments to other boards. Thank you.
Ms. Nadan, Mr. Given, Mayor Ireland.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I think the statement that was made by Councillor Butler is absolutely possible in the sense that once we return to council with more detail on the boards and committees review, what I see as the outcome of that is a bylaw that specifically addresses those council committees, and then inserting a clause that would suggest that the council code of conduct does apply to those committee members would have the same effect, just listed differently, is my opinion. Thank you.
Ms. Nadan, Given.
Yeah, and I was just going to identify for council how some of these options impact one another. So if council determines that you know, this does apply broadly to public members sitting on municipal committees, then you should also look at section number 11, which talks about the improper use of influence. And again, these are optional provisions, which, you know, if you want to just make sure that they all play well together. One, for example, 11.2 says, no member shall act as a paid agent to advocate on behalf of any individual organization or corporate entity before council or a committee of council. If you looked at that and said, okay, this applies to every public member on council committees, there are times where we have representatives of Tourism Jasper and the Chamber of Commerce, paid employees of those two organizations on council committees. Take a strict interpretation, if this applied to everybody that's on a council committee, would say that they are either not allowed on those committees because they're a paid employee of an organization that sometimes advocates to council. You know, so it just, we just need to make sure that when we think about the broad approach, that we also then remember that when we get to these other optional provisions. You know, I think it would be fair to say, it wouldn't be a surprise to me if council decided that, yes, we agree that no council member shall act in a paid capacity for some other organization to advocate to council. You know, that wouldn't be a surprise to me, but we should remember the implication on public members who are paid employees of other organizations that may advocate to council. So just that reminder to look at how these things connect to one another.
Thank you, Mr. Given, for that. Mayor Ireland.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Keller-Grampy. I agree with those comments from our Chief Administrative Officer. If you look simply at Article 4 or Section 4 of the draft bylaw, I think that raises the fundamental difficulty with trying to impose this whole suite of obligations on public members. And I don't disagree for a moment that we should expect respectful conduct from anyone who serves in any capacity on any of our committees. But to make them subject to this code of conduct bylaw starts with the requirement that they serve the welfare and interests of the municipality as a whole. But the reality is that people have individual specific interests for which they wish to advocate within the context of the greater whole. And so they are limited right from the start. You can't come and advocate for your chosen cause in the same sense if you are required as a member subject to the code of conduct to consider the interests of the municipality as a whole. So in terms of setting rules of ethical conduct for members, I fully support that, but not in terms of this bylaw. I think it's far too broad to extend it beyond members of council.
Thank you, Mayor Ireland, for that.
Deputy Mayor Keller, MP. So I'm hearing then from council at this time a general consensus that we wouldn't wish to have the draft bylaw apply to public members. Again, council may consider other ways to manage that sort of behavior. So if we're okay with that point, administration has heard you, and we'll maybe move on to the next one about the investigator. Christine.
Yes, thank you. The next bullet is investigator. So part of the legislation or regulations indicate that a formal complaint mechanism must be established through this code of conduct bylaw. And this is where this investigator clause comes into play. And I believe the default is that council is the investigator. I think in larger communities, there might be positions administratively that could be assigned to that role. But the general sense is that council is generally the investigator, but that is an option. So we would like some council input just to be sure that we put the right content in the next draft.
And Councillor, yeah, Councillor Keller, MP, you know, just for council to think about as a practical matter, and perception as well. If a complaint is filed under the council code of conduct bylaw about the behavior of some future council member, because we know it wouldn't be any of these council members, you know, if there's a complaint that is filed and the investigator of that complaint is the body of council of which that member is a you know, that councillor is a member of, it is a bit of a challenge. So my advice would be that council seek some kind of independent investigator. I have seen an approach where there's sort of a first stage, second stage, where a complaint may first be reviewed by administration to see if it meets some minimum standards. And if it is a detailed investigation where council has identified an outside party that would take those, undertake those investigations. If council felt that that was appropriate, we could identify potential ways of doing that in Jasper's context. But just, again, to think here about whether council should be in a position to have to investigate complaints potentially made by one of its members against another one of its members. That might be the kind of process where you'd want to have somebody else handling that investigation.
Mr. Given, would Municipal Affairs have a department that does that, or a UMA?
No, Councillor Keller MP. Administration could identify if there would be an opportunity to work with other municipalities or what types of alternatives. If council wished to have an independent investigator, we could do a bit of research for you and make some recommendations on appropriate approaches to doing that. We would have to do a little bit of research.
Councillor Butler.
I agree with everything advised by Mr. Given, but I'm not really sure if Mr. Given is advising us on the process or on this definition of investigator. I agree that there can be all sorts of problems with council being seen to investigate itself, but I do think that almost always in the first instance, if a complaint is filed, in the first instance, the investigating body is council, and then council would need to decide whether it would ask administration to look into it or to hire an outside investigator. And this definition seems to allow for all of those potentials, because in the end, I think it's important to recognize that any sanction provided for against an offending councillor is one that is provided by council. So it's a little bit of a sticky wicket, and I think that the broad definition that is here is appropriate. I would hate to see us immediately determine that an investigator means an outside investigator, because that could result in the perception that every time even a member of the public makes a complaint about the behavior of a councillor, that council would be bound to then hire an outside investigator to look at it, and that could go sideways in quite a hurry. So if we're talking about the definition here, it seems to me that it would serve us well as proposed.
Mr. Given?
Yeah, so Councillor Keller MP, I appreciate what Councillor Butler's saying. There is this practical matter, if you get a bunch of these, do you have somebody on speed dial, and there's additional cost to that? That's why if council appreciates the principle that complaints against council should be investigated by somebody that is independent of council, we can come forward to you with a process of what that would look like. I'd suggest that that first screen may be administrative, and then if it is something that is challenging or that complicates administration as well, that we could have a process where that's referred to an outside investigator to undertake, and that could be that could be a partnership with another municipality where it's administration of another municipality, and that's an example. It could be somebody that's a respected person in the community that that council and the community would generally have trust and faith in. But I think the principle here is who investigates complaints, and the principle about does council investigate itself or does somebody else investigate complaints about council really will determine whether people have confidence in the system in the first place. If the system is set up that any complaint first goes to council, I would suggest that might immediately erode confidence in the system. And so my recommendation would be that council should make clear that you are ultimately the authority that can levy sanctions under the bylaw. And that's completely true and appropriate. And you'd have to figure out how that applies when it's a member, that on the voting council, that's manageable. But I think the idea of investigations, my advice would be that you should refer those, first to administration for a screen, and then ultimately on to a outside investigator if appropriate. And again, there are examples that I think we can provide for you that will make clear what that process would look like and satisfy the concern about, just referring everything to an outside investigator right off the bat, which wouldn't be administration's intention.
Councillor McGrath.
Would there be any value in establishing, say, a residential committee for a complaint, like a residential complaints committee? I see no one better to kind of be that deciding voice than the residents who we work for.
Councilor McGrath, that would be one method of doing the same sort of thing. You know, which would be a whole other process, establishing that separate committee with its own mandate and terms and appointing people to it. But that is also a possible approach that could be undertaken as well.
Councillor Butler, then Ms. Nadon.
Sorry, I fear our conversation is unclear. This entire document is intended as a applying to the members of council, essentially individually. The complaint process considered in chapter 14 or in number 14 is about a complaint about the conduct of a member. We are not, and I don't think we're talking here about a complaint about council's behavior. That is a whole other conversation. I think we're talking about a complaint brought by another councillor or potentially a member of the public about the behavior of a councillor. And I think in the first instance, it is in fact up to council to determine whether council believes there has been some transgression, and then to proceed from there. So I think that's why, and why council in the first instance is the investigator. I have watched this happen in other communities where there have been complaints about a councillor, and it is council that really needs to, in the first instance at least, be the investigator. So I think it's pretty important that we keep the conversation around what the intent is here, which would be a complaint about the behavior of a councillor or a member as it is worded here.
Ms. Nadon, then Mr. Given.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. The section 14 is where the details of how that complaint procedure would function, and there are 2 steps, including an informal approach, which suggests approaching the mayor or approaching the member directly and discuss the behavior, and then if not, asking for support from the mayor. And then the formal complaint process is the following section. But having that said, and I wonder, Mr. Given, if you could give us your advice on this piece specifically as well, but to Councillor Butler's point, the definition currently that is proposed is investigator means council or the individual or body established by council to investigate and report on complaints. And I would assume that if this definition stays the same in the bylaw, then potentially by motion, council could appoint someone to that position of investigator. So it could be a 2-step process in that sense. And I appreciate Councillor Butler's point that the definition sort of covers all bases as it is currently, and that it could be further refined, perhaps with additional information to be researched from other communities, as Mr. Given suggested. But just to get us through this step today, I think that might be an acceptable process.
Mr. Given?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. You know, but we will need some clarity on, you know, should we write the bylaw in a way that has a process for appointing an independent investigator or not? You know, and that's sort of the essential question here. Because if we do want to write the bylaw that way, then there are a few other steps. I'll give an example from another community where they actually have a section around the complaint process. And it said, you know, council shall establish a complaint adjudication committee within 60 days of passing this bylaw. The committee has the authority to and may appoint an independent third party as adjudicator to adjudicate a complaint alleging a breach of conduct under this bylaw. The committee may also appoint a third party investigator if the committee determines, you know, that based on the request or information provided by the adjudicator or otherwise, that one is required to investigate a complaint. So this municipality has chosen to say, we're going to create a committee that will be the adjudicator of complaints under the bylaw, and that committee has the ability to appoint an investigator if necessary. Again, that's one example. If council said, well, we'll just investigate them ourselves, then we wouldn't have to write this section. My advice would be that we, in this case, I know that the Complaint Adjudication Committee is a committee made up of members of the public appointed by council. So it is sort of that third party, completely independent of council, respected members of the community that review complaints to say, is this a complaint that has merit and should be investigated or not? And if it should be investigated, do we need to refer it to a third party investigator or not? And then ultimately, the Complaint Adjudication Committee provides recommendations to council for follow-up actions. So that's an example of how one community has done it. And I guess what administration is seeking here is just some clarity on, do you want us to identify a approach that involves others in reviewing complaints or complaint adjudication? Or do you want us to bring forward a bylaw that says that council is the body that will do that? That's sort of the essential question. Christine's right. There are many other points to go through on the report today, but it's sort of that question of, is it council investigating itself, or is it some other body or entity that handles that process?
Mayor Ireland?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I hesitate to get into wordsmithing because we have a long document, but on this important issue, I am comfortable with the proposed definition of investigators, subject to just some slight wording change. I think that investigator means council or the individual or body appointed by council from time to time to investigate and report on a complaint, not complaints. So I don't think we should worry right now about establishing a committee. We don't even have a complaint. Council probably can handle most complaints, but should have within the bylaw permission to appoint a person or a body to investigate a specific complaint. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. If we appoint a citizens group now, it may sit idle for the next dozen years, and that doesn't seem to be a good use of anybody's time. So I would propose that we just slightly amend the definition, leave council with the ability to appoint an individual or body on a case-by-case basis as needed. But otherwise, council is the default investigator of complaints about individual councillors.
Thank you, Mayor Ireland. Councillor Butler?
I support that view. I think that slight amendment achieves exactly what we need, and I think we should recommend accordingly and move to the next bullet.
Mr. Dunn, Mr. Given, that works for you guys?
Yes,
Mr. Dunn?
duly noted.
Perfect. Okay, confidential information.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor, for keeping us moving along. So the alternative provision here and the optional additional provision are highlighted in the report, but also the complete detail of those proposals are included in the bylaw document. So we're looking at section 9.4 and section 9.5. And essentially the alternative provision would be in place. So 9.4 would be in place of 9.2. So if council selected to include this one, 9.2 would drop. And essentially it just provides more detail around keeping matters in confidence or use of confidential information. It's just a more detailed approach. And so maybe deal with that one first, and then we can discuss the optional additional provision. But mind you, they are related. And that's it. The additional one is more FOIP-based information about what is likely or unlikely to be released. But so how much detail does council want to include around confidential information and how councillors are expected to conduct themselves in relation to it?
Councillor Butler?
The point I would make on this is that the requirements that we have to adhere to are primarily outlined in two pieces of provincial legislation, FOIP legislation and the MGA. And I'm always a little concerned, and most of these provisions really point back to those pieces of legislation. So I'm always a little concerned when a policy sort of starts to restate what exists already in a higher level of policy or regulation, or in this case, legislation. So I would go with a simpler definition rather than more complicated, because we'll just miss something if we try to start listing things. And the governing legislation is out there and we know we have to adhere to it. So less is more in this case, in my particular.
Councillor Janot?
Simply agreeing with what Councillor Butler just stated. Thank you.
Mr. Don, did I see your hand?
No, but Councillor Butler's statement, I believe, is accurate. This type of information is readily listed in other pieces of legislation. One would have to look for it in those pieces to really get the detail of it, but also administratively, that's a part where in our support to council and part of training would be to inform council on what should be kept confidential and what shouldn't. And so I think all options are possible here, and subject to the will of council, we will just present the clauses accordingly.
I'm good with that. Seem to have worked so far in my 2 terms on here. Okay, if everybody is okay with that, then we'll move on. Councillor Butler.
I'd just like to point out one thing, and I think it's just a good time to bring our language up to date. Unless I'm wrong, I think the language within the MGA now around closed meetings is that they are referred to as closed meetings. And the in-camera term is kind of old. And particularly in the day of on-camera meetings, in-camera is a pretty confusing term. And you can see it right there at 9.4 where it says outside of in-camera meetings. I believe the term used now is closed meetings or closed sessions. And it might just be an opportunity for admin to confirm whether I'm right in that and to just clean up the language. I think we should, we go into closed meeting. Our meetings are either open or they're closed. And I think that's the accepted terminology now. Not a big deal, but I thought I'd mention it.
I do believe you're correct, Councillor Butler. We have changed that with Community Futures. We have named it to closed meetings instead of in camera. Any other comments? You're good with that, Ms. Madon?
Yes, thank you. That was clear. And I made a note about verifying the language, so all good. The next one.
Go ahead.
Yes, so the next one on the list is improper use of influence, which is section 11 in the proposed bylaw. So there are 3 optional additional provisions suggested in the draft bylaw, and including no member shall act as a paid agent, no member shall contact or otherwise attempt to influence members of an adjudicative body regarding any matter before it relating to the municipality. So I would suggest the assessment review board would be a good example of that. And members refraining from using their positions to obtain employment with the municipality themselves for family members or close associates. So again, just a bit more detail around the main spirit of improper influence in that first clause, but then should council wish to have additional detailing information on what that means, either one or all of these clauses could be included in the bylaw.
Everybody happy? Mr. Given?
Ms. Nadon, there was, I thought, and maybe you can point it to me. Yeah, so around the optional provision 11.4, members shall refrain from using their position to obtain employment with the municipality themselves, which is fine. I think everybody would understand that you shouldn't use your position as a councillor to get your brother a job. But the 11.4 also goes on to say members are ineligible to apply or be considered for any position with the municipality while they hold their elected position, again, fair, and for 1 year after leaving office. So just, I think important to point out that that's what it currently reads. And so if council accepts this in whole, you're also accepting that. And you should just be aware that that's what it says. Recognize that Jasper is a bit of a smaller community, and it wouldn't be a surprise for a council member at some point. You know, it does happen that you go into your life as a public citizen, and maybe either on a contract basis or some other basis, you may be in a position to enter employment with the municipality, and 11.4 explicitly says that that can't happen for 1 year after leaving office.
Councillor McGrath.
I would love to
McGrath?
dig into, sorry, can you hear me? Great, thank you.
Yes.
I would love to have conversations around 11.4 a little bit more. I do see the purpose and the intent. I would love to know if the term position would mean both employee and contractual. And, you know, I see as a 37-year-old who, you know, has skills in the area, I'm unsure if that's a good idea. Like, what if I wasn't reelected and I wanted to work at the daycare next year, and I'm qualified to do so? I don't know if that's entirely within what I would see as the best use of assets within the community, because once you've served, you do have a great ability to possibly be a wonderful municipality employee. So I'm not sure how I feel about this. I'd love to hear conversation around it. But I do think that while in the position, you shouldn't necessarily be undergoing contractual or employee work with the municipality. And I did have to resign from my casual duties with the municipality before putting my nomination papers in for this election. Yeah, I'm interested to hear what others think.
Mayor Ireland, I saw your hand.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of brief comments. In 11.1, I wonder whether it is useful at all to add the word proper before exercise. So the proper exercise of the member's official duties rather than just the exercise, because the whole thing is about improper exercise of duties. So I throw that out there. For 11.2 and 11.3, I just need some clarity, and I think council needs clarity about what might be another body established by council and what the role of a member, so a councillor, might be in advocating on their own behalf in terms of, for example, an appearance before the assessment review board. So if a member has property and they want to appeal their assessment, does this mean that they can't? That might not be fair, but I don't know how that would be interpreted. Mr. Given maybe has an answer for that.
Yeah, well, you know, I think at a high level, some of these are maybe best done by examples or hypotheticals. And I can speak to some that I've actually seen specifically. One, a member of council is the executive director of the Business Improvement Association, the Downtown Association. The executive director, you know, obviously has an interest in ensuring that their members' concerns are heard and that the downtown area is, you know, well maintained in terms of municipal services and infrastructure. And that person is also a member of council. You know, how, you know, so in a Jasper context, and again, not imagining that there are any changes, but, you know, could the executive director of Tourism Jasper also be a member of council? Could the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce be a member of council? Like, recognizing that there are times where those bodies have to take a position on behalf of their members and wish to influence the decisions of council. So I think that that's really what number 11.2 is getting at. 11.3, I think the idea here would be, and again, you know, using a hypothetical to sort of illustrate the case. If a member of council chose to, if a member of council that worked for an employer worked for an employer, and that member of council chose to go to their colleague, also a council member, who's on the assessment review board, and say, hey, I see that you're getting that, the complaint on property A. And by the way, property A business hasn't been very good. And boy, it really isn't worth as much as it's been assessed at. I really hope that you will, when the assessment review board views this, that you will, really think clearly about this, because that property isn't worth that much anymore. The hypothetical sounds a bit silly, and I wouldn't imagine anybody on council doing that, but I think that that's the type of situation that it's trying to imagine in 11.3 and to provide an explicit prohibition on. That would be where a council member was contacting and attempting to influence the member of an adjudicative body regarding a matter before it. And so assessment review, I think, as Ms. Nadon said, is maybe the easiest one. There may be other cases that we're just not imagining right now where that could happen. But that hypothetical, I think, is the type of situation, Mayor Ireland, that 11.3 is trying to get at.
If I could just follow up,
Mayor Ireland?
Deputy Mayor, I appreciate that response. My inclination would be to retract to the most general language, similar to Councillor Butler's suggestion with the last topic, with conflict of interest. I think that the overall statement in 11.1 is sufficient. You can't improperly use your position, and that's all there is to it. To start giving out examples runs us into the difficulty that we might miss some example and not have it covered. So I would prefer personally the most general phraseology and leave the rest out of it.
Councillor Butler?
Yeah, I agree with that. We would all agree, I think, with everything that we imagine 11.3 is meant to say. The wording is really difficult. Adjudicative body regarding any matter before it, so I assume it is the adjudicating body relating to the municipality. So I can certainly understand that if there's an adjudicating body adjudicating an issue germane to the municipality, a councillor ought not to speak on that. Only council should probably speak on that. But all I see is possible conflicts and misunderstandings. For example, to look at the assessment review board, for example, a councillor can sit on an assessment review board. But when he's sitting on the assessment review board, he or she, they're not sitting there as per se as a councillor. So it's covered off by 11.1. So maybe the best thing is to simply not include 11.3 for the reasons that Mayor Ireland has suggested.
So maybe let's take this, Deputy Mayor Keller MP, if we could, let's just run down them. 11.2, and again, council will have a chance to reconsider when we bring forward a formalized version of the draft bylaw. Does council wish to include this optional provision, 11.2, that no member shall act as a paid agent? And again, that gets to the, and with apologies to those organizations, because I don't believe any of them have political aspirations or anything like that, but this idea of somebody being the executive director of an organization that may seek to influence council decision. Are we wishing to provide a prohibition on that? Because that's what 11.2 would do. Would really impact somebody's ability to serve on council and as the executive director of an organization or paid agent of an organization that wishes to influence council's decisions. Your worship, I see your hand there.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Is the word paid of the most significance here? So for example, if a member of council was also by choice, not appointed, a member of, for example, the museum, could they come and advocate for funding for the museum as an agent but not as a paid agent, but would you apply a different lens if it was a paid individual, say with Tourism Jasper? I'm not quite sure exactly how this is to be interpreted, but I think having included the word paid, it doesn't mean necessarily paid for the advocacy effort, but paid generally
Yes.
by the organization.
Yes, Your Worship, but you know, I think you're exactly right. I think paid is the real operative word there. If I think it's recognized, well, I would hope it's recognized that council members are also members of their community and may from time to time volunteer their own personal time to support organizations and entities that they think are important. And I don't think council members should be prohibited from doing that, and maybe even advocating to council on behalf of the interests of that organization if it's a voluntary organization or something. I think the point here in 11.2 is, can somebody serve two employers? I mean, can you be employed by the municipality while also seeking, you know, your other employment, sort of benefiting from the fact that you have influence with the municipality? And that's where I think the idea that if you're paid to advocate for an organization, this would prohibit you from really serving on council, I think. And be clear that you shouldn't be doing those two things at the same time.
Councillor Wilson.
Wouldn't any employee of a company be an advocate for that company?
No, I don't believe so. I think, you know, Councillor Wilson, and again, it is down to interpretation, and this is why we have these discussions. I think that this is actually a really helpful discussion that we're having. But when you look at that, to advocate on behalf of any individual organization or corporate entity before council or a committee of council. So if you are an employee of a company who would regularly show up at a council meeting to make a public presentation on why council should do something, I think that's what it's getting to. If you're an employee that works at a company that has an opinion about what council should do, but you're not the face of that opinion and actively out front lobbying council at a council meeting, I think that that's still, you know, above board. Recognizing again that there are council members that are now and will continue to be employed, and you know, their employment obviously has some connection to municipal services somewhere. But should you be in a conflicted situation where you are actively in a public forum, you know, in a formal meeting of council, advocating for the interests of your employer? And this would suggest no. But you know, but if you're an employee that isn't actively and in that public forum in front of council or committee or any body established by council advocating, then you would be okay.
Mr. Given, just when my first term when I took training, I was of the understanding that when I sit on council, I leave everything at the door. There's no baggage come with you. You have an open mind. And if something comes in front of council that you're involved with, you announce that. And if you cannot make a decision on behalf of the whole community, you step away, you step off council, you go join that group, and you move forward that way, that you actually step away or you ask to be released from council not to make a decision on that. I always thought that was the way we were supposed to do things.
Yeah, I think that that's correct. You know, that is the, you know, definition of pecuniary interest. And as council members know, it's not just actual pecuniary interest, it's perceived pecuniary interest. So I think that that's correct. I think what they're attempting to do here is provide more definition to that, because there have been examples across the province where, in spite of the fact of the MGA for, you know, the past 30 years saying that council members shouldn't do that, maybe there's a perception that that has continued to happen in some cases, with some people potentially claiming ignorance. Well, I didn't know that I shouldn't do this, that, or the other thing. And I think the optional provision here says, if council would like to provide more clarity within its own bylaws, you know, I guess the other challenge is, Councillor Keller MP, if somebody did choose to act in that capacity, you know, where there might be perceived to be a pecuniary interest. And that really, pecuniary interest gets down to voting on issues that impact you. This is talking about advocating on issues that impact you or your employer. And so there might be a bit of a distinction there. But in any case, somebody contravening the MGA, the only person who can do anything about that is the government of Alberta and the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Somebody contributing a municipal bylaw at least provides council more authority to enact sanctions, even though council members, council can't remove one of its own members from council, and the minister can do that. But there are, if it's under municipal bylaw, then the sanctions are within control of the municipality rather than the government.
Mr. Given, Councillor Butler.
This is a really interesting conversation. I think we are going to need to think a little more on this, but I think the optional provision should be there. I don't necessarily agree with Mr. Gibbons' point of view that this would prevent, for example, executive director of, let's say, a chamber of commerce or something, from sitting on council. But that member would have to just understand that if they were elected, they simply could not act in any way as an agent for their organization. And that person would have to essentially ask themselves whether they're any longer in a position to do their paid job. So I think it's a pretty important provision. There is a whole area of conflict. We talk mostly about pecuniary interest, but there is case law where votes in council have been reviewed and have failed because a member voting, a member of council, is seen as being essentially unable to vote any way other than the way that person voted because they hold membership on a board or an organization. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be on the council, but they may find that they're having to recuse themselves so often that they can't do their job. So I do think it would be a good provision to leave in place. We can talk about wordsmithing it, but I'm satisfied that it's a pretty important piece to be there.
Mr. Dunn, you have what you need for this?
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Mayor. So, what I've heard so far, Mayor Island was suggesting that perhaps none of the additional provisions should be considered. We just heard from Councillor Butler that perhaps 11.2 should be also included. As Mr. Given outlined earlier, this would come back to council as a draft bylaw in the committee meeting format. So there will be another opportunity to discuss this further, and councillors can have some reflection time in between. So the tentative direction I've noted so far is to include 11.2, but to leave alone 11.3 and 0.4 is what I have in my notes, if that's acceptable to council.
Mayor Ireland, then Councillor Janot.
I'm fine with that, and I don't want to belabor it, but just because I'm probably going to forget when we come back to this. Again, the operative words of this clause are paid agent, because members are expected to act as advocates for constituents. That's our role. So you can come and advocate. The problem is you can't do it as a paid agent. But it seems to me that that is already covered in the pecuniary interest portion of the legislation. So I'm not sure that this necessarily adds anything to that. If you're there being paid to advocate, it seems to me you run afoul of the requirements anyway. So I don't see necessarily that this adds, but I don't really care whether it stays in because it is limited to the paid agent role, not to the advocacy role, which is expected, I think, of councillors.
Councillor Janot. Can't hear you, Councillor Janot. You have to unmute.
That means you muted me because I was unmuted. Anyways, thank you very much for that. As this is far too very detailed into the discussion, and one of the reasons is that I haven't partaked is there's some very good people that are making some changes here. I just looked up at the word, the definition of the word wordsmith, an expert in the use of words. So that discounts me because I have no expertise, and I often get reprimanded and questioned for my usage of words. So I would only have one comment, and that is on item 11.4. That is in keeping with the comment that was made by Councillor McGrath. Right at the last line, I would change the 1 year to 1 month. I don't see any reason why people would be withheld for 1 full year to take a casual position, say to work with operations as a grass cutter in the summertime, for example, or those kind of things. I think that I don't see the reason for the 1 year. So I'd like to change it to 1 month. Otherwise, everything is fine. Thank you.
Councillor Demota.
Well, just out of curiosity, because going back to the prior discussion on eligibility and Councillor Butler brought up the position of the chamber manager, but then what if you're the chamber president or the representative of the Jasper Hotel Association, or the Rotary for an example of that matter. Like, you're not a paid representative, but you represent a collective group that's appointed you to that position. I understand where Councillor where Mayor Ireland is saying that we're all representatives of our constituents, and whoever we're representative as an employer on our thing, that kind of takes a back seat. But there are kind of like those gray areas where you're appointed to a certain body, but you're also a council member, and there may not be any pecuniary interest, but or even perceived. But then there's that level where I've been in trouble before, where you just kind of, even though there's no pecuniary interest, it's better to take yourself away from that. I don't know how this policy affects that, but those are some of the gray areas.
Mr. Given, is there a rule within the MGA that you have to be 1 year after office? I know,
No, there is not, and that's why this is here as an optional provision if council wishes to prohibit it. I think there are many cases. I can think of at least one case in Northern Alberta where a council was searching for a CAO, and you guys are fine, you don't need a CAO, you've got a great one. But where a council was looking for a CAO, and they hired, in the end, they weren't successful in their search, and they did hire a member of council. A member of council resigned and became the CAO sort of immediately after. And there's other examples that I can think of where council members during their council term were hired by the municipality and had to resign their position. This, I think, really goes one step further to say, well, it had already been clear that you can't work for a municipality and be on the council. This is going to say, does council wish to provide any other cooling off period? This provision is very common at the provincial and federal levels, or at least has become common over the last couple of decades, where federal staff are subject to a cooling off period after their employment with the federal government, where they can't lobby the federal government, for a period of time. And it also applies to elected officials at that federal level. And so I think that the intent is to bring some of that similar approach to the municipal level of government. And that's why it's here for consideration of whether council wishes to do so or not, or what might be appropriate in Jasper's context, recognizing that in a larger community, maybe I'll use Councillor McGrath's example that she brought up. In a larger community, maybe there are 15 different daycares that are privately run. And so if somebody was a daycare service provider, they would have lots of other employment options, where in Jasper, there is one daycare that is run by the municipality. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that the context is different from community to community, and Jasper's smaller size probably means that there is an increased potential for a council member to consider employment with the municipality in some capacity after their time on council is done.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Councillor Butler, then Councillor McGrath.
I was just going to propose that we just, if we choose to add 11.4, that we just put a full stop after the word position while they hold their elected position. I just don't see the need, for all the reasons that have been discussed, to really extend it beyond that. I don't think we're liable as an organization in that sense. So
Councillor McGrath,
If we want to include.
sorry.
I agree with that statement. I would just love to know the definition of position. Does that include contractual work? For example, I have taught, I don't know if I've taught it throughout my term, but I've taught daycare yoga before. So does that mean that I don't have an opportunity to bill $60 to the daycare for teaching yoga, if that's the way it is? Or does that mean that Scott can't bid on any municipal projects? So we just need some clarity on what the term position means, so that if it is contractual, that it's really just clear. But I agree with taking that last part of section 11.4 out, as Councillor Butler suggested. It's a really small pool of engaged community members, and to limit people potential employment could in fact limit potential candidates in future elections. And I wouldn't want to see anyone limited by their future career opportunities considering running for council.
Councillor Janot.
I believe that the discussions around the topic that Councillor McGrath has just mentioned is well covered in the Municipal Government Act under the MGA. So I don't see that as a concern for Councillor McGrath.
Okay, I think we received some direction there. Christine, do you want to take us to the next point that we want to get some direction on?
Actually, I'm going to call it 10-minute recess for the council and the public. So it is now 11:44. We will return at 11:55. 10 minutes, everybody okay? So Councillor Wilson, Councillor Demona. Just wait a minute. Thank you, Councillor Demona. I'll call the meeting back to order. Mrs. Dunn.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Keller-Rampe. We are progressing and are heading into the last stretch, I believe. And orientation and other training attendance is the title of section 13, where there are a few alternate provisions and optional ones as well. And essentially, the first couple items deal with whether training sessions are optional or mandatory, subject to council approval and things like that. So there is a mandatory councillor orientation that is required post-election. But following that, the completion of that training session, how does council wish to address councillor attendance at other events? And I think that is a current item of relevance for council, as in we've dealt with this question, or the question has come before council in recent months. And so 13.1 is mandatory, so every member must attend orientation. That does match the provision of the MGA. And then 13.2 would be where those alternate provisions could take place instead. And 13.2 reads, unless excused by council, every member must attend any other training session organized at the direction of council for the benefit of members throughout the council term. So does that reflect what council wishes to direct for its members when it is organized at the direction of council? So that is quite a specific instance. And then the alternate provision suggests that attendance at additional training sessions throughout the council term is discretionary, is one of the options. Or it could be that every member must attend all orientation and other training organized at the direction of council again. So anyway, a few nuances there. I'm kind of lost at 13.4 myself. But anyway, that's the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Dunn. Comments, suggestions, Councillor Demota.
Forgive my neighbor's dog here if you hear something. Just I'm just concerned about the wording mandatory, just because let's say we set up a workshop for council and administration or whatever, even if it's just council and one of us has other obligations, you know, where does that lie? What's the if it's mandatory, what would be the fallout from not attending? You know, what would be the repercussions, you know?
Councillor
Mr.
Demota,
Given?
yeah, then Councillor Demota, you would be in contravention of the Council Code of Conduct bylaw and subject to whatever penalties it establishes, which I think are probably later on, you know, we're going to get there. But really it is, you know, and so that's what it's asking is, you know, how stringent does council want to be in policing its council members' attendance? And this is important to have, I think, before a new council starts so that they know, you know, what the expectation is of them. They may choose to amend the bylaw, that would be their right, but really is, you know, 13.4 is the highest requirement. Every member must attend all orientation and other training organized at the direction of council. So it actually has to be something that council has directed administration to organize. And it says that through the whole term, you must attend all of it. You know, 13.3 kind of backs that a little bit off, says that you must attend the orientation training, but additional training is just throughout the course of the term is discretionary, up to you whether you make it or not. And then 13.2 and 0.1 sort of split the difference. They say, okay, well, the orientation training is mandatory. And 13.2 goes to say any other training organized at the direction of council, you know, you must attend unless excused by council. You know, so it sort of says, yeah, so you know, 13.2 would suggest that, you know, partway through the term, council says we need some training on a thing, administration goes and organizes training on the thing, and you're not able to make it, then you need approval of council not to attend that training. Where 13.4 basically just says, nope, you must plan to come to everything that's organized at the direction of council.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Councillor McGrath and Councillor Butler.
Thank you very much. On this topic, I would see 13.3 as a nice way to go, but I would suggest changing the term is discretionary to the best of the member's ability. I think that it's important that we all attempt to be present at everything to the best of our ability, but sometimes there are circumstances beyond anyone's control, and to be excused by council by way of vote would sometimes be impossible due to circumstances such as emergencies that would leave you unable to get a vote before your attendance was noted that you weren't going to be there. So I believe it's in the best interest of the community to have your council members there and present to the best of their ability and committed to that.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Councillor Butler.
I was just going to weigh in that I think 13.1 and 13.2 are perfectly adequate as they stand, even with Councillor McGrath's concern, which I understand. It doesn't even say that council needs to excuse through a motion, and council could excuse a member who was unable to attain because of illness or something. So I think that keep it simple, and 13.1 and 2 are just fine. If council does choose to put on training for all council members, I think it's obvious that the expectation would be all would be present unless someone was unable to and council chose to accept that, because presumably the decision to hold the training would be one that was arrived at by majority of council. So I would leave it as it's suggested there.
Mayor Ireland.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I just want to comment on 13.1, the mandatory orientation training, which is fine, but I thought that we ran into an issue 3.5 years ago that relates to the question of after a member takes the oath of office, and is it statutorily required that we have that wording? Because it is possible that a counselor, for reasons that are unavoidable, misses the swearing in, and then would be ineligible to take the orientation session, it would have to get rescheduled. So unless there is some need to say within 90 days after the oath of office, if it could be changed to say after election, it just gives a little more latitude that somebody, as I think did happen last time, missed the swearing in date, but should still have gone to the orientation. Why would you organize that more than once if you didn't have to?
Mr. Given?
I wonder, Your Worship, if it would have anything to do with the potential for there to be council members who might not be elected at a regular election, or potentially municipalities where no election takes place because of acclamation. But because if you're acclaimed, or if you come on in a by-election, in any case, you do have to take an oath of office. And so maybe that would be what it's getting to. I know that the municipality is required under the Act to offer, so there is a requirement for municipalities to offer training. I think what this is getting to is to saying, is there a requirement for the council members to attend it? And I appreciate your point about the election also being an appropriate sort of defining point, but maybe the intent here is to think about other situations that we're not considering outside of a regular election cycle.
Yeah, thank you for that. I throw it out there just for some consideration, and I haven't looked at that section in the provincial legislation, so I can't speak knowingly, but it could conceivably create a small problem, but if we're required to do it, then that's what we do.
So council is indicating we go with 13.1 and 13.2. Sure. Is everybody in agreement with that? You good? Okay, Mr. Dunn.
Thank you. The next sections that are optional provisions, so optional additional provisions. The first one, 13.5 and 13.6, is about remuneration and expenses, and transparency, accountability. Again, those are principles that are, I think, broadly understood by councillors, but just providing more detail in the code of conduct should council wish to go in that direction is the question.
And if I can, counsel, I think some of these are here, and all of you certainly are ones that are conscientious public servants, in your roles as elected officials. I think that these are here because there have been examples across the province where, after the fact, somebody who has behaved badly, and one of their colleagues or somebody in the public said, well, you're not allowed to do that. And so he said, oh, I didn't know I wasn't allowed. Oh gosh, and so I think the point here is to put these in writing so that if somebody wished to file a complaint, they can specifically point to an action and relate it to, oh, well, no, 13.7 says we shall not accept gifts or hospitality, other than things that are reasonable. And this thing that you did over here was unreasonable. Or somebody could point to 13.5 and say, well, that's an extravagant use of public resources, and that's why I'm complaining. I think the point here is to provide some legislative grounding for the types of complaints that might happen. Hopefully would never happen. And again, I think most reasonable people would make the right decisions. Having this kind of thing is so that in the case where something unexpected happens, you have something that provides some framework for decision making. A counsel or an investigator having to decide whether somebody was in contravention of the bylaw, there has to be a term in the bylaw to contravene, if that makes sense, right? Like if you had no speed limits, how would we ever say somebody was going too fast, right? Like you have to have some definition of what wrong is, that you can say, well, you're actually in contravention of point number 13.6. And here's why I think so. These are optional. They're not required to be included. And it is up to council to determine what is appropriate for Jasper.
I think the more in there, the better. I think it's we're accountable, and as you said, like if somebody wants to question somebody's expenses, it's clearly there. I'm okay with 13.5 and 13.6. Anybody not? So I think we're good to go with those two, Ms. Dunn.
Yes, will do. And I'm repeating myself, but again, if someone has concerns between now and the next draft of the bylaw, you have a chance to reflect on it and bring that up in that context. So all good. The next one is optional provision in gifts and hospitality. Members shall not accept gifts, hospitality, or other benefits that would, to a reasonable member of the public, appear to be in gratitude for influence, to induce influence. There's 13.8 provides a bit more around a dollar limit of a gift that could be received. And then 13.9 is about leaving a gift with the municipality when the member ceases to hold office. So if it's something that's received in the context of an official protocol, that it's municipal property and not specifically to given to the member of council. So again, a bit more detail around how to navigate receiving gifts or hospitality. And like Mr. Given said, it's a basis for someone to potentially file a complaint, but I also see it as, to someone who's new on council, a bit more guidance around how that works and how to proceed. So that could be helpful in that sense to include them.
We currently follow that without it being written. Am I not correct? Like we do not provide hospitality unless we have permission from the mayor, and any gifts we receive on behalf of the municipality, we provide to the municipality.
Yeah, Councillor Keller-Harmpy, I think a part of this is kind of goes to the you go to the AUMA convention and a company says, hey, we've got tickets to the Oilers game, come and sit in our box. Is that okay? You know, I think there's a perception, a reasonable perception of the public that those types of actions are intended to influence how council elected officials feel about different companies. And I think we can all acknowledge that there's a certain level of gift that doesn't influence your decision-making as an elected official. And that may be different based on the individual and your individual circumstance. I think a common practice is for municipalities to say, what's a reasonable level? Like, you know, am I going to vote for company A's interest because they took me to an Oilers game one time when we were in Edmonton for a conference? Maybe, maybe not. And it's about what level council would wish to set. This could also go into saying that, and it doesn't necessarily here, but it could say that members may accept gifts or hospitality above a certain level, but the disclosure is required, which is something else that I've seen, where you have to report a gift over a certain amount. And I'll give an example. I'll give an example of 13.9. I received a cowboy hat from the Grand Prairie Stampede, and it looked to me like it was not a dollar store cowboy hat. It was one of the like proper fancy cowboy hats, and so I actually checked to see how much that hat was worth, because I had the sense that they could run into the couple hundreds of dollars or more. And so I did a bit of due diligence just to see if I should be reporting the cowboy hat that the Stampede gave to me. And it's, you know, on its face, sounds a bit silly, but at the same time, when the Stampede comes and says, we would like a grant this year for $50,000 towards the Stampede, could somebody out in the public say, well, Bill really liked his hat, and that's why he voted for the $50,000. You know, it just provides some level of public disclosure to say, no, I wasn't taking anything under the table. This was all reported. And yes, I did receive this gift that was above the $200 threshold. You know, it was a $300 hat. And I was fully transparent about that. Nobody could suggest that I took the hat on the sly, you know, and that it influenced my decision-making. I think good practice here to identify what makes sense in Jasper's context, just for the public's interest.
Councillor Wilson.
Just to shed some light on your pronunciation of stampede, I was wondering, what are you talking about and why is he saying it that way? But I did a quick Google search and it looks like you call it the stampede up in Grand Prairie rather the stampede.
Yeah, 100%. And it has messed me up for my entire life being born and raised in Grand Prairie. I could never get the Calgary stampede right. It took me a long time to get that. But yes, up here we have a stomping good time.
Up here.
Councillor Juneau.
Mr. Given mentioned the possible influence of being in a conference in Edmonton and getting Oiler tickets. That would be influential. But if the conference was in Calgary, would the same influence apply if you got Flames tickets?
Okay. I guess council is fine with leaving those points in the code of conduct. Do we want to set a dollar amount? Or we shall come back to that later.
We can leave that as we can leave the insert dollar amount. So when it comes back to the final draft, council may just want to think about that, about what is a amount where you might wish to say you either shall not accept or may accept but must disclose. I don't think we have to deal with that today, but you just might want to give a little bit of thought to that. Keeping in mind, that there are a lot of different situations, hospitality. If somebody buys you dinner somewhere, you say there's a $50 limit on gifts. Well, it is completely possible that a meal somewhere at somebody else's expense could exceed $50. So just think about that as before we come back with the next draft.
Okay. Councillor Butler?
Yeah, the problem I have with setting dollar limits is that it's so hard to think of all circumstances and eventualities. And I hate the idea that a dollar limit then becomes a target or goal. If we say $200, do people think of that as being, oh, well, as long as I stay under $200, I'm okay. And that doesn't feel very good either. If we wanted to include something like 13.8, I wonder if a similar standard to the one above would be applied, where it might be some language around value that would not be excessive in the eyes of a reasonable member of the public or something like that. It doesn't really get us to a hard point, but would something like that be better? I don't know. I do like the idea of in rare circumstances where there might be something of higher value, the disclosure provision seems to me to make sense. Like Mr. Gibbons said, he considered whether he should disclose the value of his cowboy hat. Something like that could be helpful as well.
Ms. Nadon?
Yes, thank you. I think as a default, we will include them and provide that opportunity for more discussion if it's required, is what I get from this discussion. And so the next one, optional provision, elections campaign. No member shall use any facilities, equipment, supplies, services, municipal logo, or other resources of the municipality for any election campaign or campaign related activity. I don't know that that's specifically spelled out somewhere else, particularly use of logo is the one I would be familiar with, but that is here for council consideration.
Councillor McGrath?
I think this would be super important to include 1310 as it's written.
Mayor Ireland, then Mr. Gibbon.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I have some reservations, and again, not on the principle, but it's the abuse that is problematic, not necessarily the use. So we are not yet at that stage as a municipality, but someday we might be at a stage where a member, well, I guess if they're just campaigning, unless they're an incumbent, they're not a member. But could an incumbent not legitimately rent municipal space and use it for a campaign purpose? I think that is prohibited by this. If an incumbent has a laptop provided by the municipality, does that mean they can't use that laptop to go on their Facebook page for campaigning? I mean, the principle is fine, but I think the wording is really important. And from my perspective, it's too broad to be useful in this situation. We should think about how it might be narrowed to avoid abuse, but not to eliminate the possibility of proper use of facilities or equipment.
Mr. Given?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Keller-Ampe. I was going to say something very similar to the mayor. The example of a laptop is a good one that council might want to think a little bit about. You know, is it reasonable that a council member would use a computer device that's provided to them by the municipality to run their campaign on, or should the expectation be that they run that on their own personal computer separate from the municipal one? Open question. I think the point about facilities and municipal property, so if somebody wanted to host a campaign event, an election event in Robson Park, this would seem to prohibit that. I think what the mayor was getting to is the improper use. And so if you went through the right channels and booked the space and paid whatever fee kind of went with the space, is that okay? And so I think if council wished to include this, but also thought that we should maybe be a bit more specific about defining what improper and proper use would look like, we could make some amendments to that.
Councillor Demoda.
Well, I'm glad that the mayor brought that up, and I was trying to pull up, our policy on personal devices, computer. We have an allocation for X amount for the term. Once that allocation, like if we purchase that and get reimbursed through the municipality for that, is that still a property of the municipality, or is that just something that is councillor's property after that transaction is in place? Because let's say we don't make it through our term, do I reimburse the municipality back for the amount of computer that's left over, or do I turn that in for a reimbursement? So when it comes to something like that, I know it's super technical, but when you have the question, if this is a property, the laptop that I'm using to go and campaign on Facebook or other social media, is that improper use of municipal assets? I'm not sure. So there's gray area there and something to contemplate.
Councillor Butler.
If you go back and read clauses 12, 12.1, 12.2, which deals with municipal property generally, I think it's really all covered there, and allows for kind of latitude that Mayor Ireland was referring to. So I don't really think that this clause adds anything very helpful. It's broad enough to be difficulty and contentious, and not specific enough to really change anything. It simply adds in language around an election campaign, but I think that's adequately covered in the items under number 12.
So we should eliminate 13.10 because 12.1 and 2 covers it.
Or I wonder, Deputy Mayor Keller-Ampe, if what Councillor Butler is saying, maybe we could combine, see if there's a way to combine the 13.10 and sort of blend that in into 12.2 or the 12 area municipal assets, because the logo in particular is one. I think there may be a general prohibition. There should be a general prohibition from any elected official campaigning with a municipal logo on their signage. But we could see if there's a way to combine those two sections in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Councillor McGrath.
I also liked the the explanation that Mayor Ireland provided, improper use versus proper use. So if you're willing to pay the facility fee, you should be able to, just like anyone else, should be able to rent, say, the activity center, but definitely not improperly. You should not be not paying a fee, let's say, for use of the activity center.
You have what you need there, Mr. Don?
I do, and I would suggest in addition to Councillor McGrath's comment, like would be, for example, when I read services, I think of the services the communications department, for example, could provide would not be appropriate if a councillor was trying to, a current councillor was trying to use those services to support their campaign, whereas someone new would not have access to that type of support. So very much in line with whatever the general public would have access to is okay, but not anything additional. And yeah, I like Mr. Given's suggestion to try to incorporate them. I have noted that. And then the last item is the informal complaint process in itself. So those two sections, 13.11 and 13.12. So is there a wish to have a two-step process for that complaint, it being informal first and then followed by formal? Or should it all just go to formal, I guess? If the informal complaint process was removed from the document, then it would by default go to only a formal complaint process. So council's thoughts and comments on this one.
Hello.
Sorry, go ahead, Councillor Butler.
I'm very much in favor of this. I think it's quite well worded. I think it's what we would all expect. I think it's what we would probably plan to do and would hope members of the public might do prior to putting things down in writing. So I quite like it.
Mayor Ireland, do I see your hand?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I will register some trepidation about the informal complaint process. When a complaint process is informal, it is more likely to be misinterpreted and has a higher likelihood of going off the rails and then result in a more formal complaint that the informal complaint process wasn't properly handled. So if these are serious matters, and I am not convinced that they should be dealt with in an informal manner. If a councillor or a member is, there's an allegation that they have contravened the code of conduct, I think that's serious and it should be formalized, not left at an informal level. So I like the formal complaint process. I think it should be open to any person to activate that process. But I don't believe I can really endorse an informal complaint process. I think that just will lead to further complaints, not the resolution of complaints.
Councillor McGrath?
I agree with the statement said by Mayor Ireland that I believe that any complaint should undergo a formal complaint process.
Councillor Janot?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So is a suggestion to completely remove the informal complaint 13, 11, and 12? Sorry. Yeah, 13, 11, completely remove them? Is that the suggestion? I don't mind that.
Mr. Don?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. That is the suggestion, is how I interpret it from the template that's provided by AUMA. It's an optional, so you can decide to include it or not. And yes, if you chose to not include it, it would then remove 13.11 and 13.12 in its entirety. But having that said, if council wanted to vary it, that could also be done. But yes, the current proposal is to include it or not include it.
Councillor Butler?
Yeah, actually, I am convinced by that argument. It occurs to me that if it's not in there, there's nothing to prevent a person from approaching a member that they feel may have transgressed and ask the question, do you think you've transgressed? I think you might have to have a conversation about it. None of that is prevented. And it may avoid a complaint. But if there is a complaint to be made, I agree with Mayor Allen that it should probably be made formal. So I accept those arguments. I think we should just leave it out.
Okay. Mr. Dunn, you have enough information?
Yes, thank you for that. It was a bit lengthy, but a good exercise, I think, that should allow us to return to council with a draft bylaw that should meet your expectations and provide you a bit more time to consider whether you would like to see any other changes. So our proposal would be to return to the next committee of the whole meeting, which would be April 27th with a draft bylaw. And then Mr. Given shared in the chat what the motion should be from council. If you're satisfied with the direction provided today, essentially to direct us to come back with the draft bylaw. And then at that stage is when council committee would recommend council give first reading to a bylaw, I guess, which would then provide, put that item on the next regular meeting motion. So what we would be looking for today from council at this stage would be a motion that says that committee direct administration revise the code of conduct bylaw and bring a draft back to a future committee of the whole meeting. I would suggest that meeting would be the 27th, but at council discretion there. We have the information we need, so we should be able to bring that back in 2 weeks.
Councillor Butler?
Thanks, and I'm satisfied with that direction. I just wanted to make one other point, and that is that council does have a code of conduct now. It is contained within our procedural bylaw. And I'm just wondering if administration used that document, has looked at it. If you have not, I would suggest that one quick step to take would be to review that document and see if it throws up any flags. If there is something in that document that we have not addressed in here, it might be worthy of inclusion or at least of conversation. So just wondering if that would be advisable, just to look at what we already have and make sure we're not actually dropping something that we may value in our existing bylaw.
Go ahead, Mr. Dunn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. We can certainly do that, Councillor Butler, and have a look at what would be worthwhile including. And I think the format and the statements that are made in the code of conduct that is included in the procedure bylaw has quite a different format and intent than what we're seeing here, which explains why we were offside with the legislation by not addressing the specific items. We can certainly have a look to see if some of the spirit of the current code of conduct bylaw could be reflected in this new version. But also, I just made a note that we should probably include a provision that removes that section of the procedure bylaw. So you can only modify a bylaw by bylaw. So we should include a clause that suggests removing the old one from the procedure bylaw. And having that said, the work on boards and committees will also impact that procedure bylaw. So we're inching closer and closer to quite significant edits to the procedure bylaw. So this will all take place and come into shape in the next few months here, I would suggest. So thanks for that observation.
Any other comments? Councillor Demota, sorry, I didn't see your hand there.
Well, actually, I was going to defer to the mayor on this one because I vaguely recall a reasoning for merging the code of conduct in there, but it doesn't ring any specific bells. But I remember there was a reasoning behind, there was some sort of efficiency or reasoning for condensing that process. And I can't remember what it was, but there was a purpose there.
Yeah, if I may, Deputy Mayor Keller, MP, Councillor Demota, that might have been the case. There may have been some reasoning why it was incorporated there, but since that time, the province has made a change, and this legislative change to require you to have an independent council code of conduct bylaw. And so that's why we're here today.
Understood. Thank you.
So, Mr. Dunn, you've everything you need. You need a motion from committee to move this forward, but before do that, Mayor Ireland.
Thank you for that, Deputy Mayor. I appreciate that we'll have another opportunity to look at this, but building on Councillor Butler's point, I think that under the existing code of conduct, there is also a statement of principles. And I think it would be useful to incorporate such a statement into a new bylaw. So whether it is just referenced in the preamble or elsewhere, it is a statement of principles given by council, and I think it has value as a document to be incorporated. And then just as a heads up, I suppose to administration when they're redrafting this, I'll very quickly go through and I won't argue the points, but it seems to me that the reference in 7.1 to federal and provincial laws ought to be repeated in 7.3, which is restricted just to bylaws. I think we will need some discussion over section 10 conflicts of interest, because I am concerned that there is an inconsistency between conflict of interest as defined in the Act, which is very narrow, and section 10.2, which talks about the appearance of influence and conflict. And that has always been problematic, but I think that with this wording, we might simply exacerbate or at least continue that degree of conflict. So I ask administration to take a look at that. And finally, a section we didn't deal with at all, 15.1, I really, I struggle with how that is to be interpreted. It says we shall uphold the letter and the spirit and the intent of the bylaw, which I think implicitly recognizes that they may not be the same. So which one takes precedent? If the letter doesn't match the spirit, does the spirit and the intent come first? I take it that wording was taken from somebody else's formatting, but I can not see that being anything but problematic. Something has to rule. I presume it's intended to be the spirit and intent, not the precise language or the letter of the bylaw, but I can't interpret that phrase. So I just leave that with you for the next round. Thank you.
So, Mr. Given, do you need council to, as a committee, to move that this comes back to the next committee of the whole, or we just expect it back?
Yes, no, Councillor Keller-Ampe would like that. That way it does get on the motion action list and is tracked and we can report on it. This one's going to come back quite quickly, but it is a helpful process to make sure that if council is asking us to go away and do some work, that we're tracking that work so that you can see it and the public can see when you've asked us to do it. So please, yes, a motion.
Councillor DeMott.
Yeah, just before we moved towards a motion, I just wanted to get some more clarity. Just going back to number 13, I'm sorry we're retracting back there, but something came into light after in our discussions, whereas the voluntary training attendance. So, recently I'd requested for us to be able to attend a couple of sessions put on by the Alberta, the elected officials education program. Should that be covered in here, or,
Councillor Demota, maybe if I may, Deputy Mayor Keller-Ampe, I would suggest that that's a bit different. There are numerous courses and education opportunities for council members.
Right.
This would only specifically apply to ones that are organized at the direction of council, where council has said, get us training on bylaw development, get us training on electronic records management, but where council has specifically directed administration to establish some training or education opportunities, rather than ones that the council member identifies of their own volition, which we already have a process for handling that.
Right, makes sense. Thank you.
Do I have a councillor willing to direct Councillor McGrath.
Yes, I'm happy to make that motion.
Okay, Councillor McGrath has made a motion that the policy development and the council code of conduct bylaw will come back to committee of the whole on April 27th. All in favor? It's carried. Okay, policy development and review, Councillor Butler.
Thank you very much. Thank you also, Mr. Given, for bringing this back on the agenda. We had it on the agenda previously at my request and simply ran out of time. I don't think this itself will take a lot of time. It is very timely because we just engaged in a long conversation around policy development. Even though that policy is contained within a bylaw, it is still policy. And I would make the observation that in my years on council, I think I have seen many instances and continue to see instances of discrepancy or divergence between policy and practice within the municipal organization. Sometimes this is because council has not met its duty to provide clear and up-to-date policy, and very often that is the case. And I have to say, I think we are getting better at that every day, with every meeting. That we recognize that when we are concerned about goings on in the municipality, very often it is because of a lack of policy. In other instances, it's because the organization is not following policy as written. There are always reasons for that. I don't mean to suggest malfeasance. Very often it's because they find the policy unworkable. But to simply vary policy rather than request for revision of the policy, I think is not a great way to go. My particular concern here, to be perfectly open about it, lies around policy and practice around fiscal oversight. I have concerns in that area. Some of these we have discussed from time to time, but I will speak by example. We have, for example, a policy under our fiscal and financial control policy that a requirement that certain financial documents be brought to council on a regular basis. One of them is a payables ledger, and that has not been done since 2018. Another is the require for a monthly expense statement. And that is not being done. And my concern is that it results overall, in a sense, on the part of the public, that we are not exercising as an organization, including council, adequate and ongoing fiscal oversight. And when we simply vary policy and we just simply stop doing what our own policy says we're going to do, then we leave a gap. And I don't think that is healthy. We leave a gap in policy where what we should be doing is reviewing the policy and updating it and ensuring that everyone in the organization knows that that's the policy, that's what we're meant to be doing. And everyone on council knows that if a policy is out of date, it's our responsibility to address it. So clearly, the organization either needs to conform to policy, or if the policy is found wanting, we need to edit the policy. I have concerns broadly across the organization. As I said, fiscal oversight is one of them. But there are other examples that we've all seen come by. One of them, for example, was commercial cardboard collection, where when we looked at it, we discovered that our policy doesn't even say that we should be doing that at all. Yet the organization has drifted into doing that. And, you know, to be fair to the organization, they brought that question to us and said, you know, our policy, or lack of policy in that case, or our good, well-intentioned efforts to provide a service to the community that is not written in policy is costing the organization a lot of money. And we dropped that ball. We honestly, I think, simply didn't finish that conversation. We should review the policy, the applicable policy. If we don't have one, then we should create one. And we should keep our conversations as we know we're meant to at the policy level. And I can point to a number of other situations where I really have concerns that we're lacking policy, not following policy, that we're simply not up to date. I don't really want to get into a lot of examples here, But when some of these items were brought up in a previous conversation, Mr. Given had suggested, and I have come to fully agree, that an approach to these concerns is to try to put the organization on a footing and within a framework where policy is updated on a regular basis. And an example was given in Grand Prairie, where there is a policy review policy. And I looked into it and I discovered that in fact we have a policy development policy. And interestingly, it is policy A-001. So it must have been the first policy ever to have been developed, or at least among the first policies to be developed in the municipality. So my chosen way to propose that we move forward with what I acknowledge is a suite of concerns around areas, particularly of fiscal oversight, where I am worried as to whether we are collectively as an organization doing due diligence. My chosen way forward is to suggest that, given that there is no conceivable way that we're going to make any reasonable dent in addressing some of these issues, which would be represented in many different pieces of policy in the organization in the remainder of our term, is that we at least take a step to put the organization on a footing of ensuring that we review policies on a timely basis. And there have been, as I mentioned earlier, many examples where councillors have come along and said, you know, I'm not sure our policy is up to date here. It has had to do with bylaw enforcement. It has had to do for sure with the one we just dealt with. I remember Councillor Demoda mentioning that we're missing, that our policy is out of date with respect to public engagement. So my proposal is that we attempt to enact, or at least to begin or create a framework for ongoing revision of policy. So when I reviewed our policy development policy, I noticed that what is missing in the policy development policy is really any language about reviewing and revising policies. It tells us in pretty good language, I think it's a pretty good policy. It tells us how we ought to go about developing new policy, but it doesn't say anything about when or how often or under what circumstances, or even why we would choose to review policy from time to time. So my suggestion, to keep it very simple, as a first step toward addressing some of the concerns that I at least have around the connection between policy and practice in the organization, is that we propose, is that the committee direct administration to make recommendations for a review of our policy development policy. In short, I think we should change it to a policy development and review policy. And if you take the time to look at our policy development policy, I think it's great. It's policy number 1.1. It's the first policy we've got. And it would be a good place to start. I'm tempted to suggest that I think we should move forward from there and review our fiscal and financial control policy, because that is the area I am primarily concerned with. But I realize that we have to start somewhere. So let's review our policy development policy, and let's look at it in terms of providing within there a framework for how policy review discussion should be brought forward. I think they would need to be brought forward by, they could be brought forward by administration, obviously, by councillors, through motions in committee, or however we think, but at least it would get us, I think, underway to a long, and I admit undoubtedly a long and ongoing process to try to bring our practice in the organization into alignment with our policy, or the other way around, bring our policies in line with practice. So my suggestion today is that committee of the whole direct administration to make recommendations for review of our policy development policy, to provide a framework for regular and ongoing review of existing policy. At some future committee meeting, I do not wish to impose a time limit on that. I know that administration is very stacked up, so I'm not suggesting we're going to see something back within a month or so. It'll take some time, and I'd be happy to hear about what kind of time frame might be involved, but I would hope that we could accomplish at least that before the end of our term in council. So that is my motion. I can reiterate it if needed, and thank you for your attention to this. And I'm open to questions and certainly to comments from administration.
Questions for Councillor Butler? Councillor McGrath?
Not a question, just a comment. I'm super happy to have this before us. I agree, Councillor Butler, that it's time that we have a policy before us to regularly review and see the policies of the organization. Policy development and policy review is something that has, in my short experience as a councillor, been something that I am really keen on learning more about and how to implement more policy level decision making in the community. And I'm really happy to see this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Thank you, Councillor Butler. Any other questions or comments for Councillor Butler before Mayor Ireland?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I join with Councillor McGrath in thanking Councillor Butler for bringing this forward. Just as a point of historical interest, perhaps, although it's numbered A001, I think that we saw the need for a policy development policy at about the time that this was formulated in 2010, and then we reorganized the policy manual to give it the number that made it look like it had been there from Genesis, but it did come a little bit later because we saw the need. But you're right that it is an evolving document and needs to be reconsidered. And I have no hesitation in agreeing and supporting your motion in that regard. I would say, though, that even based on your comments, Councillor Butler, although there is a need to focus on policy development, I think there is a greater need to focus on policy implementation. And perhaps we need a separate policy, which is a policy implementation policy, to help guide the day-to-day work of administration and to help guide the weekly work of council. Because it's not that we can't develop a policy when we see the need. It's the ongoing implementation of the policies that has led, I think, to the issues that you have raised. So I just throw that out there. I'm perfectly happy to start with a policy development, policy review, and then see what we need from there. But it is getting a handle on the daily implementation of policies that we have that seems to be the real issue at stake.
Councillor Butler.
Mayor Ireland, your point is a really good one, and I deliberately did not want to dive too deep into deeper conversations, but one of the difficulties I find when reviewing our policies and have found is exactly what you talked about. Many of our policies are divided into two. So there's the policy, the head policy, I guess, and then there's the administrative procedures, which is where the rubber hits the road and the devil is in the details. And I find very often that those administrative details are written in such a way as to make them probably, not sitting in those chairs myself, but probably very difficult to follow. So that is part of the difficulty is let's write policy and understand what it looks like from an implementation point of view, so we don't set up policy that is essentially very difficult for administration to follow, and so that they can follow the policy. So that is exactly the sort of conversations that need to be had. I just wanted to mention one more thing that I'd forgotten, which is that for anybody interested in looking, one thing I can say is our policies are extremely well presented, organized. We have, as we are required to, a very clear and accessible policy manual that is well numbered, is divided into sections, is clearly available on the website. So anyone, members of the council or public, who want to know, well, what is our policy on a given area, is going to be able to find it pretty easily. And I have to say, it was not until recently that I delve very deeply into the policy manual, but I have to congratulate members of the administration who keep the policy manual up to date. While some of the policies may be out of date, the manner in which they're recorded and arranged and made available for the public to see is absolutely up to date. I was pretty happy to see that.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. Thanks to administration, and thanks to Mr. Dunn and her department for keeping the website up to date for our public and for council's benefit. So Councillor Butler made a motion that we move the policy development review to a committee meeting in the future for administration to come back with this important topic. All in favor? Any opposed? That's carried.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. 8.6 utility expense discussion. Councillor McGrath.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Keller-Harampi. It's my intention today to bring forward a utility expense discussion. After going through budget, I couldn't help but to feel as though some time should be spent on thinking about our energy costs within the municipality of Jasper. The utilities at $1 million alone per year leaves me thinking about the future and a sustainable path forward for the town of Jasper. I'd like to present a motion that the committee direct administration to bring forward recommendations to reduce utility costs in municipal facilities.
Questions for Councillor McGrath? Discussion? Councillor Demota?
Well, I'd like to thank Councillor McGrath for bringing this forward. And, you know, I was hoping that we'd already have an environmental responsibility committee established by this point. And, you know, I know that everyone's working on it, and I'm sure, and I was hoping that something like this would be brought forward in that manner. But here is perfect. And so I commend you for your progressive thinking, and I support this initiative.
Mr. Given, comments, workload?
No, Councillor Keller-Harampi, the way Councillor McGrath has presented this, I think it gives administration some options to identify an appropriate process. I'd suggest that this wouldn't be a one-shot thing. There likely is a bit of a process of investigation that would be required and recommendations that would fall on, for a range of different opportunities to reduce municipal energy expenses. So I think the motion is fine, and we can take that away and then come back to committee with how we would recommend tackling that big topic. I think as long as there's sort of a recognition that it would likely be a sequential process, that it wouldn't immediately be turning down the lights in the activity center, that there'd be some more thought that would go into that, but we can work with the motion as it's presented, absolutely.
Thank you. I'm going to call that motion. All in favor? Any opposed? It's carried. So Mr. Given will come back in due course. Okay, any other new business? Councillor Demota.
Yeah, I guess I apologize. We don't have another new business category or item on the agenda. And I have one that I'm going to bring up with our committee's updates. But one thing that was brought to my attention during the break is that we've removed the ECC update from our committee of the whole agendas. And I, at the time, I didn't think it was premature, and I still don't. But now that we've seen an increase in some positive COVID cases in Jasper, and it seems to be progressing in that direction, I think there's some concern in the community about their comfort level and what council is doing about the communication to the rest of the community on what's happening. And I know that we're limited by what we receive from the AHS, but I think we also have, a responsibility to be reporting back or get some information to provide, some level of comfort to the community, or at least let them know that we're aware of, what's happening, and, thinking about what the future might look like for our community going forward.
Councillor McGrath.
Thank you for bringing this up, Councillor Demota. I wholeheartedly agree and do hear from residents on a regular basis that they do seek more communication and more transparency, even if it's just words of comfort from their municipal representatives, being us as the leaders in Jasper. I try on my own social media networks to bring a sense of hope and to offer love to our community. But I do agree that it would be really beneficial for the residents of Jasper to hear both from the organization of the municipality of Jasper and from their elected representatives on a regular basis throughout these really challenging times. There's certainly no negative aspect coming from increased communication.
Councillor Demota.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So through you to Mr. Given, what are the levels that ECC is meeting at right now, or in what capacity? And would it be too much to ask to have an update added to our committee of the whole agendas going forward? I guess two-part question.
Sure. So to be direct and clear, one, the ECC is not meeting. We are no longer in emergent or emergency situation, as I would assess it. We are now through, or well, not through, excuse me, we're well into the third wave. And so I think our community, the business owners, residents, and the municipality are fully understanding about the external context. And so it isn't the same sort of situation where we, at the start of the pandemic, needed to activate the ECC because nobody knew what was going to happen. I think we all know very well what is happening and what should happen. I think we all know very well that everyone must respect and follow the public health regulations that are in place, must respect and follow the municipal masking bylaw, which continues to be in place. And so it is sort of the ECC, well, we need to continue to have internal conversations and coordination across service areas. We do talk regularly with our external providers, such as the RCMP or Alberta Health Services. There's not a need for a formal ECC meeting, which there's a process behind and staff time. That I don't believe is required now. Council will know or may not have seen, actually. We did issue a COVID update on Friday of last week, highlighting that cases in Jasper were on the rise, and reiterating some of the steps that we've taken as a municipality. We could provide that more as a CAO update, in the future. A part of the challenge, though, is that every 2 weeks council committee of the whole, or every week council and council committee of the whole meetings happen in the morning, and by the afternoon there's often new information, and so it is a bit, it ends up being a bit behind the times. So my suggestion would be that I could provide council with information on municipal activities as they arise related to COVID, and that council and administration should continue to refer the public to the Government of Alberta and Alberta Health Services for the most timely and relevant information about public health restrictions and case numbers, because they will get that on a more timely basis and a more accurate basis from those two authorities than they will from the municipality. We will always be lagging because we're just not in charge of the information. So if council's interested, we can certainly go back to a process where I provide some update about municipal activities related to COVID. As council is aware, we are undertaking those regularly, especially given the rising case counts as an employer, but also as the municipality, for services to the public. But no, we won't be starting up the ECC again, because again, while we are in a serious situation, that does mean that all members of the public should be paying attention to the situation and their behaviors. I would suggest that we're not in a emergent or emergency situation where the right actions are unknown, because I think we all know the actions that we all need to take.
Well, if I may follow up.
Sure.
I do appreciate the update from the municipality on our website, and I think it's a good update. So attaching ourselves to that with the same similar communication that I've been getting. This is probably for the rest of council. I know it's been some recent time since we've collectively taken a position on, you know, where we're following direction from and how and why. And, you know, and whether we're continuing taking that stance. And I'm bringing that forward just because there have been representatives or leaders in you know, higher levels of government that have taken different positions or perceived different positions. And there have been some requests that have come forward saying, well, where does council stand and where does the municipality stand? And I think it's important at least to provide some level of comfort in our position, at least regardless of what it is, so that the rest of the community understands where we are and, you know, and what we think is best for the community. We have a busy summer coming for us, and I think it's good that everybody understands and maybe just has an update on where we are and how we're feeling.
Thank you, Councillor Demoda. Councillor McGrath and Mayor Ireland.
I can pass and let Mayor Ireland go ahead, as I've already spoke on the subject, and wait until he's added to the conversation. Thank you.
Mayor Ireland.
Well, thank you, Councillor McGrath. Firstly, I appreciate Councillor Demoda bringing this up. I was going to make a comment under agenda item 11 in any event. At 10:27 this morning, I received a formal invitation from Mayor Don Iveson to join he and a number of other mayors across the province in putting out a common video message encouraging all residents, all Albertans to follow public health guidelines. It's the position that this council has taken from the outset. I think that it continues to be the position of this council, that is exactly what is needed in our community and elsewhere. And so I was going to raise that in any event this morning, just to confirm with council that I am authorized on their behalf to put out that joint message with other mayors across the province who have seen the need, particularly in light of recent pronouncement by others, to reinforce our support for the public health guidelines that are in place at this time to protect our residents, our visitors, our businesses, and our destination reputation. So I'm happy to do that with the support of council. I'm inclined to do it in any event, but I much prefer to do it with the support of council. So I leave that with you. And just so you know, it's quite interesting, but it would follow essentially the format that we test drove earlier today at 9 o'clock. So the same sort of idea. We will share videotapes for a common message to get out to residents of all Alberta communities.
Thank you, Mayor Ireland. Councillor McGrath.
Thank you very much, Mayor Ireland. I think that's an excellent idea. We did test drive a little session this morning, and that type of a session is exactly the increased communications that I would be hoping to see and have been asking for the majority of this term, for us to be engaged with our community. So many communities are doing excellent jobs on campaigns, and yes, they're still relying on the resources from Alberta Health, and they're relying on the numbers from Alberta Health and the information from Alberta Health. But this week, our community would have benefited from messaging coming directly from us and directly from the municipality of Jasper in regards to hope and in regards to unity and in regards to togetherness. Our community really needs us as their leaders to stand with them and stand for them, and be, especially because we have a communications position that is dedicated to communications, amping up our communications during times of increased stress and increased need so that our community sees us with them.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Councillor Demoda.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you both for that. And I didn't mean to jump the gun on this. I was unaware that the mayor was going to bring this up later on. So anyway, healthy topic for conversation, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Councillor Butler.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that with the addition of a new position into the communications department, which is something council asked for, and not least because we recognize the value of communications during this time, I myself think that administration is doing a great job of communicating. I've been perusing the website and looking at the information that's on there. Of course, we could always have more, but more communication isn't really helpful unless there's something more to communicate. There is undoubtedly, in difficult times like this, a sense that people want to know more and want to know more and want to know more, but there is only so much that anyone can tell them. The prevalence of COVID within the community is not something that we directly have, can be engaged in. That is a matter for Alberta Health Services, and most of communications around COVID need to be handled at that level, as we have said many times. But I am quite happy with the manner in which and the amount of communication that the organization has been putting out around COVID. I think that those who are concerned are quite readily able to find on our website and through our Facebook feed and so on, the information that they need to find. So I just want to congratulate administration on the job well done, and I know we can expect a continuation of that good work.
Thank you, Councillor Butler, for that, and also thank you, Mr. Given, and the communication staff, Ms. Sadan and her staff. They're doing a great job in the current circumstances. Thank you. And if we can move on, correspondence, community garden expansion. We received a letter from the Jasper Local Food Society with 2 requests. One, if they could have some more spots, and 2, the AMA building and a greenhouse. Comments, I'll let Mr. Given go ahead first, and then I'll open it to council.
Sure. So this is here for council information. My recommendation would be that council receive the request for information and direct administration to bring forward a recommendation on the request. Administration hasn't done any work on the request at this time. I can tell council, and you may remember from the budget discussions, that the AMA building is in the budget for demolition. Administration would want to take a look at the request in detail and provide advice to council on the implications of the request. I think all of us would agree that having more garden plots and a greenhouse and everything else would be good for the community. We just may want to have a little bit of a check first to see, so what if we do that? What are there any technical limitations or any other things that council might not be aware of at this stage? So my advice would be that council receive this for information and direct administration bring forward a recommendation at a future committee meeting.
Do you need a motion for that, Mr. Given? Okay, Councillor McGrath.
I'd be happy to move that.
Awesome. All in favor? That's carried. I think I've lost Councillor Wilson. I do not see him on the screen. And
sorry to interrupt, Deputy Mayor, but I did get a text from Mr. Wilson that he had to leave.
okay, thank you, Mayor Ireland. And we will expect to see this back on a committee as a whole in the near future. Am I correct, Mr. Gill? Perfect. We also received correspondence for Senior Week. They have sent us a declaration to declare June 7th, 13th. Mr. Given.
Not much to add, Councillor Keller-Hrampe. This is a request from the Minister of Seniors and Housing for Jasper to essentially declare Seniors Week in the municipality of Jasper in accordance with their template approach, here for council's consideration if they wish to provide a formal motion endorsing such a declaration.
It's always important to recognize our seniors, and we've done this in the past. Do you have a councillor? Councillor Joe, are you going to make a recommendation?
No, I just like to comment that you acknowledge the seniors. I'm one of them.
I'm nearly there myself.
But I'm willing to make a motion that we issue this proclamation. Thank you very much.
Mayor Ireland, I saw your hands.
Okay.
Mayor Ireland, did you wish to speak?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, so can we, that declaration will come back in front of us next week, Mr. Given, on the 20th, or Mayor Ireland can do that today?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I caught the motion or who made the motion, but we should have a motion that council, something along the lines of, that council committee of the whole endorse the request for resolution or for declaration or something along that line, so that there's a formal council or committee. And I really am fine. This is procedural anyways. If all of you sitting as committee of the whole wish to provide direction to the mayor to endorse this, then that would be suitable for us, and then we could just deal with it. I certainly wouldn't want to miss Seniors Week just because of procedure. Well, I guess we've got till June, so we're totally fine if we want to forward this on to council for approval.
Okay, then we'll see it back next week on April 20th. Councillor Janot made the recommendation that committee of the whole direct administration to bring this back on April 20th. Thank you, Mr. Given. Okay, we have our motions list that has been circulated. This afternoon, we do have Strategic Priority Committee, and we will have utility rate model back at that session, I believe, Mr. Given.
Yes, Councillor Keller, MP. So the motion action list is intended to keep track of administrative work and council requests. We have a number of updates, and so I would look for a motion to update the list with the following changes. That we can strike the utility rates model. We will present that, we'll have a discussion, we will have a discussion with council about that this afternoon. There may be additional work that would come back at a future committee meeting for public decision making, but we will have that discussion this afternoon, so that one could come off. The paid parking pilot project, committee of the whole has provided a recommendation to council. Administration has completed that work, and so that one could come off. I think the next steps that council would see down the road would be reporting. But again, that would just be the course of business as we implement the program. But I don't think there are any other outstanding council actions related to that, so that this one could come off. Additionally, the council code of conduct bylaw, Ms. Nadon delivered that today, and so that item could come off as well. Again, recognizing that it is replaced by the additional motion that council made. So this should get to be a cycle where council can see the pace of issue raised at council, referred to administration, administration comes back with a report, council deals with the issue and it comes off, or there's another cycle of that completes. But my recommendation would be to remove code of conduct bylaw, paid parking pilot project, and utility rates model from the motion action list, recognizing of course that would be updated with the new items that arose today.
Okay, and you need a motion for that.
Please, yes.
I have a member of council to make that motion to take off paid parking pilot project, utility rates model, and the code of conduct bylaw. Councillor McGrath. And even though we do know that paid parking pilot project will come back in the fall, and later this month, the code of conduct will come back as a bylaw, and the utility rate model new direction will be given as part of the strategic planning session. All in favor? Carried. Thank you, Mr. Given. Okay, council representation on various boards. Councillor McGrath, Mayor Ireland, and then Councillor Janot.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Kelleher MP. I am attending a library meeting tomorrow, as well as a community conversation, and I'm registered for the AUMA Leaders Caucus for the next 3 days.
Thank you, Councillor McGrath. Mayor Ireland.
Thank you. I have a museum meeting this evening. I too, as with Councillor McGrath, am scheduled to attend the AUMA Municipal Leaders sessions over the next 3 days. And I just want to confirm the matter I raised earlier, my involvement in the joint work put together primarily by Mayor Iveson. And I didn't specifically request approval, but I think I had it. But if I could just get councillors that joint messaging that I have been invited to partake in. I see thumbs up and nods of heads and a frozen smiley face of Councillor Demota. Thumbs up from Councillor Butler. Thank you.
I think it's great, Mayor Ireland. Thank you. Councillor Janot?
After many delays, a meeting of the the Council for the Trans-Canada Yellow Highway has been scheduled for next Friday, the 24th, which I'll be participating via Zoom.
Thank you, Councillor Janot. Anybody else? Not, I'll move on. Upcoming events, we have Strategic Priorities Committee this afternoon at 1:30, AUMA Leadership Conference, April 14th, 16th by Zoom. May 4th, Intergovernment Meeting at 1:30, virtual meeting, and May 6th, the Jasper Park Chamber of Commerce General Meeting, 9 a.m. Zoom. After this, we have an in-camera. It's 1:15. I do not believe there'll be any, sorry. Councillor Demota, Mr. Given.
Lo siento, Speedy Gonzalez. I apologize. I had my hand up when we were wrapping up on the council reports for committees. On behalf of the HR committee and our chair, Councillor Junot, I just wanted to report back that we've had a few delays, but we're meeting in the next little while to finalize our recommendations for council remuneration for the next term, as well as our progress on the CAO performance evaluation. And I'm also meeting with the I'm trying to move fast here and I apologize. Culture and Rec Board this Thursday at noon. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Demota. I do apologize. Mr. Given.
I was going to be very brief, Councillor Keller-Hampy. My suggestion to council would be that maybe we start the recognition of how long we've gone and that we've got 15 minutes before the strategic priorities. I'd suggest that maybe we start at either 2 or 2:30, giving people a time for maybe a bit of a walk and a stretch after being seated all morning before starting. So administration be prepared to start strategic priorities at your direction, either 2 or 2:30. Would be my advice, and leave it up to you to decide if you could hear. And then also we could forego the in-camera. I could provide a bit of a brief update, again, recognizing that there's no municipal business coming out. I could provide that update at the end of the strategic priorities meeting rather than everybody sitting a little bit longer. So if council is comfortable with both of those, if you could just tell us what time you'd like to start strategic priorities, 2 or 2:30, that would be helpful, and we could see you all on that later on.
Okay, is everybody on council okay with that? Those changes to the agenda? Okay, Councillor McGrath.
Thank you, and I apologize for forgetting to mention this earlier, but I believe that this week, after last week, there is some gratitude due publicly to administration, specifically our CAO and Bylaw department, for working so swiftly after last Tuesday's council meeting to pivot and adjust and reshape how patio seating in Jasper was going to look. And as we can see in our downtown core, the administration from the municipality has made it possible for businesses to act as fast as possible. And I'd just like to express, I'm sure behalf of all of us, huge gratitude to administration and specifically Mr. Given. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Excellent job. I've had a lot of great reports back on how swiftly and how great the municipality was to work with. So we're not going to do, we've deleted the in-cameras. So can I have him, first of all, what time do we want to re-meet for this strategic planning? 2:30. Feedback from council. Mayor Ireland, what works with everybody's schedule? Because I know everybody probably had a schedule for 1:30. 2:30?
I prefer to.
2? Seems to be consensus for 2 o'clock, Mr. Given. Okay, I need a motion to adjourn. At 1:20. Thank you, Councillor Butler. All in favor? Okay, we will see everybody back. Mr. Given, we have a link on out for Zoom for 2 o'clock. Excellent.
Yes,
We'll
it's
see
in the calendar invite.
Great job,
Okay.
everyone.
I just want to thank everybody, and I'd like to thank the public who joined us for this morning's session, and I will see you guys all this afternoon. Thank you, everybody.